Larry Dexter's Great Search, or The Hunt for the Missing Millionaire by Howard Roger Garis. Part 2, Chapter 16, Sullivan's Queer Accusation. "Whom did you say it was?" asked Grace. "Mr. Jack Sullivan," repeated the butler. "I asked him for his card, miss, but he said he hadn't got none. Told me to mention his name, and said you'd know him." "But I don't know him," protested Grace. "I never heard of him in my life. There must be some mistake. Are you sure he wants me, Peterson?" "He said so, miss, but I'll ask again." Whereupon the butler, as stiff as a ramrod, went back to the door where he had left Mr. Sullivan standing. "He means you, miss," the functionary remarked as he came back to the library. "I wonder what he can want," Grace said, half to herself. "I don't know any such person. I think there's a mistake. I will see him and tell him so." "Wait a minute," exclaimed Larry. "Perhaps I can explain this. I think I know Mr. Sullivan." "Who is he?" "A political leader of the 8th Assembly District." "What does that mean?" "I'm dreadfully ignorant of politics," Grace remarked with a smile. "Poor Papa was much interested in them, but I never could make head or tail out of political matters. I have an idea that Sullivan has called here in reference to the disappearance of your father." "Why do you think that?" And Grace turned pale. "Do you think he brings bad news?" "On the contrary, I think he has come in search of information." "But how can he be interested?" Thereupon Larry told of his interview with the politician, based on what he had overheard in reference to Mr. Potter and the extension of the subway. "Wasn't your father interested in building a new line of street railroad?" he asked of Grace. "I'm sure I don't know. I never kept track of Papa's business matters." "I see. What ought I to do about this, Mr. Sullivan?" Grace asked. "I think you had better see him," replied Larry. "I'd be afraid to, alone, and Mother has such a headache that she can't come downstairs. Will you stay in the room with me?" And she looked appealingly at Larry. "I'm afraid if I did, Sullivan wouldn't talk. He knows me and imagines I have done him a wrong which I have not. I believe he considers me his enemy. He would probably go away without saying anything if you met him in my presence." "But you don't need to be actually present," said Grace, with sudden inspiration. "Look here, this is a little alcove," and she pulled aside a hanging curtain and showed a recess in the library wall. "You can stand in there and hear whatever he has to say. I'd feel safer if you were near. Of course there's Peterson, but he's so queer, and I don't like the servants to hear too much about poor father's disappearance. Will you stay here and be at hand in case I want you?" "Of course I will," replied Larry after a moment's hesitation. "I have no idea that Sullivan will annoy you. He's too much of a politician for that. And I may be able to get a clue from what he says, though I don't imagine he knows where Mr. Potter is." "Then I'll see him," decided Grace. "Peterson," she called. "Yes, miss." "You may show Mr. Sullivan in here." "In here, miss?" And the butler looked at Larry. "I said in here." "Very well, miss." "Now hide," commanded the girl in a whisper, as soon as Peterson had gone to the front door, where Mr. Sullivan had been kept waiting, as the butler evidently thought the caller did not look like a person to be admitted to the hallway until he had showed his credentials, or until he had been authorized to come in by some member of the family. Larry got behind the curtain. No sooner had the folds ceased shaking than Mr. Sullivan entered the library. Larry could see him, though the young reporter himself was hidden from view. Grace remained standing. "You wish to see me?" she asked in formal tones. "Yes, Miss Potter." And Larry noted that Sullivan was ill at ease. "I called about your father. Do you know where he is?" "No, Miss Potter." "How should I?" And Sullivan looked quite surprised. "Then why did you come?" "I came for some information, miss." "We have none to give you. We have told the police and the reporters all we know." "Are you sure?" And at this question Sullivan's bearing became different. He seemed bolder. "What do you mean?" demanded Grace. "I mean just this," went on the politician. "I've got a right to know where Mr. Potter is. A great deal depends on it. I've got to find him. Riley wants to find him. He and Riley had some deal on, and it's time it was put through. It's going to make trouble if it isn't. I want to know where Mr. Potter is." "So do we," answered Grace. "If this is all that you came for, you had better leave." "It isn't all I came for." Sullivan's voice had an angry ring. "I don't believe you have told the police or the newspapers all you know about this thing." "I believe." "Leave this room," commanded Grace. "Leave it at once, or I shall ring for the servants to show you the door." "What do you mean?" "I mean just what I say," and the politician's voice was angry now. I mean that you know where your father is, and that you're only pretending you don't. It's some game to fool Riley and me. We'll not stand for it. I want you to tell me where your father is." He took a step toward Grace. She seemed dazed. "Tell me, do you hear?" And probably because he was so excited, the politician made a movement, as if he meant to grasp the frightened girl by the arm. "Oh," she screamed. "Don't touch me. Larry, quit that," cried the young reporter, stepping suddenly from behind the curtain. "That will do, Mr. Sullivan." Larry spoke more calmly than he had any idea he could under the circumstances. He seemed master of the situation. The very suddenness of Larry's appearance caused Sullivan to recoil a step. He fairly glared at the young reporter and then looked at Grace, who was trembling from the words and actions of her rude visitor. "You hear?" exclaimed the politician in a whisper. "So that's the game, eh? I thought the leader was in on it." "There's no game at all," cried Larry indignantly. "I am here in the interests of the paper to learn all I can about Mr. Potter's disappearance." "Then ask her to tell you the truth," cried Sullivan, pointing his finger at Grace. "She knows where he is." "I don't." "I wish I did," and Grace faced her accuser with flashing eyes. "Don't repeat that remark," said Larry, calmly, though there was a determined air about him. "You know better than that, Mr. Sullivan," and Larry stood fearlessly before the politician. In the unlikely event of a physical encounter, Larry had no fears, for he was tall and strong for his age. "It's true," Sullivan repeated, in a sort of a growl, for he was a little afraid of the tempest he had stirred up. "I say it isn't," Larry replied. "I have worked on this case from the start, and I know as much about it as anyone. What's more, I think you know more than you are willing to admit. I haven't forgotten the interview you gave me, and which you denied later. I think there's something under all this that will make interesting reading when it comes out. You don't suspect me, do you?" And Larry noted that Sullivan's hands were trembling. "I don't know what to suspect," the young reporter answered, determined to take all the advantage he could of the situation. "It looks very queer. It will read queerer still when it comes out in the leader. How you came here to threaten Miss Potter. You're not going to put that in, are you?" asked the politician. "I certainly am. If you do, I'll—" "Look here," exclaimed Larry. "You've made threats enough for one day. It's time for you to go. There's the door. Peterson," he called. "Show this man out." Larry was rather surprised at his own assumption of authority, but Grace looked pleased. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir," replied the butler with such promptness as to indicate that he had not been far away. He pulled back the portieres that separated the library from the hall and stood waiting the exit of Mr. Sullivan. "This way," he said, and a look at his portly form in comparison with the rather diminutive one of the politician would at once have prejudiced an impartial observer in favor of Peterson. "This way, if you please." "You'll hear from me again," growled Sullivan as he sneaked out. "I'm not done with you." Larry Dexter, Chapter 17. Grace Gets a Letter. The door closed after Sullivan. Larry, standing in the library entrance, watched him leave the house. Then he turned to look at Grace. "Oh, that was terrible," the girl exclaimed, almost ready to cry, but bravely keeping back the tears. "What a horrid man. What did he mean?" "I'm sure I don't know," replied Larry. "I doubt if he does himself. Mr. Potter's disappearance has evidently sent some of his plans askew, and he is hardly responsible for what he says or does. Don't let it worry you. I wonder if he knows where my father is? I don't believe he does. If he did, he would hardly come here, hoping to deceive you or your mother. No, Sullivan wants to find out where Mr. Potter is just as much as we do. Why, I can't tell yet, but he has a good reason, a strong reason, or he would not have acted as he did." "What had I better do?" asked the girl. "Do nothing. Leave it to me. I will write something for the leader that will make Sullivan wish he had stayed away from here. Mother doesn't like this newspaper publicity. I can imagine it is not very pleasant for her," admitted Larry. "But it has to be borne if we're going to find your father. The more the papers print of the affair, the better chance there is of finding him. If he is staying away, for some reason he will see what a stir his disappearance has caused, and will be anxious to arrange matters so he can come back. If he is being detained against his will, the publicity will cause his captors an alarm which may result in their releasing him. So, too, if anyone sees him wandering about, they will recognize him by his picture, or by the description, and inform the police. Suppose he should be dead, and Grace whispered the words. "Don't think that for a moment. It is over 2 weeks now since he disappeared, and not one word have we heard from him. Persons have been known to disappear for longer periods than that, and yet turn up all right," said the young reporter, endeavoring to find some consolation for the girl. He related several instances of similar cases that had come to his attention since he had been in newspaper work. "Now don't put too much in the paper about Mr. Sullivan and me," said the girl as Larry was going. "There has been sufficient printed already, and some of my friends think I must have a staff of reporters at my beck and call to get my name mentioned so often," and she smiled at Larry. "I'll not mention you any more than necessary," he promised, thinking that Grace was much prettier when a smile brought out a dimple in each cheek. Larry's description of Sullivan's visit to the Potter house proved to be what Mr. Imberg described as a corking good scoop. None of the other papers had a line about it, of course, for Larry was the only reporter in a position to get inside information, and Sullivan was not likely to give out any account of his strange call. "You seem to be keeping right after all the ends of this story, Larry," said Mr. Imberg the day after the account of Sullivan's visit was printed. "That's what we want. Now what sensation are you going to give us today?" "I don't know. Not a very good one, I'm afraid. I've been to Mr. Potter's office. There's nothing new there, and I guess I'll have to fix up a rehash of yesterday's stuff unless I can strike another lead. Tomorrow I'm going to work on a new plan." "What is it?" asked the city editor. "I'm going to the steamship docks and—" Before Larry could finish, the telephone on Mr. Imberg's desk rang, and as this instrument has precedence over everything else in a newspaper office, Larry broke off in the midst of his remark to wait until Mr. Imberg had answered the wire. "Yes, he's here, standing right close to the phone," he heard the city editor say in response to the unseen questioner. "Some young lady wants to talk to you," Mr. Imberg went on, handing the portable instrument to Larry. "Young lady to speak to me?" murmured Larry as he took the telephone. "This is Grace Potter," he heard through the instrument. "Oh, how are you?" called Larry for want of something better to say. "Come right up," Grace said. "I have some news for you." "What is it?" "I have a letter from my father." "A letter from your father? Where is he? How did it come? Who brought it? Is he home?" Larry fired these questions out rapidly, but there was a click in the phone that told him the connection was cut off. Evidently, Grace had no time to tell more. "Hurry up there," exclaimed Mr. Imberg as soon as he understood the import of the message Larry had received. "This will be a feature of today's story. Hurry, Larry." Larry thought the transportation facilities in New York were never so slow as on that journey to the Potter house. He tried to imagine, on the way up, what sort of a letter Grace had received from her father. That it contained good news he judged from the cheerful note in her voice. Things seemed to be happening quite rapidly, the young reporter mused, as he got off at the elevated station nearest to his destination. "First thing I know, I'll find him, and then I'll not have a chance to see Grace anymore." He dwelled on this thought, half laughing at himself. "I guess I'd better stop thinking of her and attend strictly to this disappearance business," he murmured as he went up the steps of the Potter mansion. "She's too rich for one thing, and another is I'm too poor, though I'm earning good wages, and we have some money in the bank, for the sale of the Bronx land, as related in Larry Dexter, reporter, had netted Mrs. Dexter and her children about $10,000. Larry's ring at the bell was answered by Grace, who, it would seem, had been on the watch for him. "I thought you would never come," she said. "I telephoned ever so long ago." "I came as fast as I could," Larry responded. "Where is the letter?" Grace held out to him a small piece of paper. On it was but a single line of writing. It read, "Am well. Have to stay away for a time. Don't worry. We'll write again." It was signed with Mr. Potter's name. "Are you sure it's from your father?" asked Larry, thinking some cruel person might be trying to play a joke, or that some enterprising reporter had sent the message for the sake of making news. Such things are sometimes done by New York newspaper men, though their city editors may know nothing about it. "I couldn't mistake father's writing," replied Grace. "Mama knows it is from him, and she is much happier. But we can't imagine why he has to stay away." "When did you get this, and how did it come?" asked the reporter. "The postman brought it a little while ago." "Where is the envelope?" Grace handed it to Larry. An inspection of the postmark showed that it had been mailed in New York in the vicinity of Substation Y, which was on the east side. It might have been dropped in one of the many street boxes from which collections were made for that particular office, or it might have been mailed in the station itself. Not much to trace him by, said Larry. He looked at the envelope again and saw that there was a small ink blot on the lower left-hand corner, and that the corner where the stamp was affixed was smeared as if with some sticky substance. Anyone would think you were a detective, said Grace, as she watched Larry examining the envelope. What does it matter now? We are sure Father is alive, for that note was posted yesterday. That has made Mother and me happy. Of course we want to find him, but I don't see how you can buy that letter. I thought you'd like to know about it to make a little item for the paper, and I wanted to repay you for your kindness to Mother and me. I haven't done anything, Larry replied. I am only too glad to be of service to you. But I may be able to find out something by this envelope. I don't see how. Will you let me take it to the substation? Of course. But what good will that do? I want to ask the sorters and clerks in charge if they remember having handled it. I may find the carrier who brought it in from the box, and he can tell in what locality it was. But how can they remember when they must handle thousands of letters every day? Perhaps they cannot, but it is worth trying. You see, in that section of the city are mostly foreigners who write a peculiar hand and use stationery anything but clean or of this quality. This envelope and paper are of an expensive kind. Yes, there's some Father had made to order for his private correspondence. I did not know he took any to Europe with him, but he must have. It may be that a letter carrier or mail sorter took enough notice of the envelope to remember it, Larry went on. Besides, there is a small blot on it, and the way in which the stamp is put on shows that some glue or paste was applied to the envelope. Probably he used an old stamp which had no mucilage on. To make it fast to the envelope, your father, or whoever posted the letter, would have had to use some sticky substance, and in doing so, he has put it on a little too thick. Some spread out from under the stamp and soiled the envelope. Of course, the sorters and carriers don't pay much attention to the pieces of mail, except to see that they are properly stamped and addressed, but it's worth trying. This envelope would attract attention if anything would, and you're going to use that for a clue? I'm going to try. It may be useless. If we can find in what particular locality it was mailed, we can have the police keep a watch for your father. He may mail other letters there, but my father is not a criminal. Why should the police watch for him so particularly? They're keeping a general lookout now, but I wouldn't like to think they were lying in wait for him. It's the only way to find him, said Larry. Of course it's unpleasant, but there is evidently some mystery here, and that's the best way to clear it up. But he says he has to stay away for a while, argued Grace. Maybe he wouldn't like to be found. Of course that point has to be considered, Larry admitted. But I take it you and your mother want to find your father, or be in a position to communicate with him. Oh, we do, exclaimed Grace. Then we'll have to ask the police to help us. There is no disgrace in it. Everyone knows your father is honorable, and if he wants to disappear, that's his business. It is also perfectly right for you to try to find him, and Larry stopped. Well, for what? Asked Grace, seeing the reporter hesitate. I don't want to alarm you, Larry went on, but I was going to say that there is no way of telling but what someone may have imitated his writing and forged his name. I am sure that is my father's writing, the girl said, earnestly. Of course I may be mistaken. I hope not. I prefer to believe that note is from him. It makes me happier. Of course, there is only the barest possibility that this note is not from your father, but we can take no chances. That is why I want to make a systematic search, beginning at the substation. And where will it end? Asked Grace. I don't know. But after that I am going to the steamship piers of all the lines that ply between here and Italy. What for? I want to see if the captain of any of the steamers recalls any man answering your father's description having come over with him. He must have sailed on some steamer, as he is in this country, if that note is from him. That's a good idea, commented Grace. How I wish I could help you. Couldn't I? Couldn't I go around with you? That is, to the steamer piers? I've crossed the ocean several times, and I know some of the captains of the Italian lines. Maybe that would be a good idea, said Larry, secretly delighted with it. You can come with me tomorrow. I will go to the substation now, and we'll let you know what I learn. Then we will make a tour of the piers. You'll be of great assistance to me, for I know very little about steamers. I'm so glad, exclaimed Grace. It has been terrible to sit here day after day and only wait. I wanted to do something to help find Father. Now there is a way. I wish I was a boy. No, I'd rather be a reporter. They can do so many things. And Grace laughed more heartily than at any time since her father had disappeared. I'm afraid you give us too much credit, replied Larry. We do our best, but we don't always get results. Are you sure your mother will let you go? Of course, Grace replied, in a way that showed she was used to having her own way. When will you come for me tomorrow? In the morning. I can hardly wait. Now don't forget. I'll be your assistant. Maybe I could learn enough to be a woman reporter someday. I have no doubt you could, Larry responded as he went out on his way to the substation with the envelope, having telephoned to the police of the letter and securing a promise that no other reporters would be informed of it for a while. As he walked along, his thoughts were busy in many directions. The receipt of the letter, the clues the envelope offered, the plans for a search among the ship captains, and above all, Grace's offer to accompany him, made Larry speculate on what the Potter mystery was coming to. I wonder what the other fellows on the leader would say if they knew I was working this assignment in company with the millionaire's daughter, said Larry to himself. I guess I'd better not say anything about it. They make fun of me. I know it's all right to take her, or I wouldn't do it. Besides, if she knows the captain, she can be of considerable aid to me. Queer, though, for Larry Dexter, who used to rush copy, to be hunting for a missing millionaire in company with his pretty daughter. It was odd, but no other line of activity is so filled with strange surprises or brings about such a variety of work as being a newspaper reporter of the first class. Larry struck several snags when he attempted to get information at the substation. In the first place, none of the officials in charge would give him any news about the envelope unless he got an order from the New York postmaster himself. The government has very strict regulations in regard to giving out information about mail matter. But Larry was not daunted. He telephoned to Mr. Berg, and the forces of the newspaper were set to work. Certain political wires were pulled, and as there were on the leader men to whom the postmaster was under obligations, that official gave the clerks at the substation permission to tell Larry whatever he wanted to know. Sorry we had to have so much red tape about it, the substation agent said when Larry came back with a magical paper that opened the mouths of the subordinates. Oh, that's all right, the reporter said. I know how it is. Now, what I want to know is in what box was that letter posted? And he held out the envelope Grace had given him. Rather hard to say, spoke the head clerk. I'll show it to all the carriers who are in now, and later to those who come in during the afternoon. They may recognize it. It's a little out of the run of ordinary envelopes we get in this section of the city. One after another, several carriers scanned the envelope. All shook their heads, until it came to an elderly man. As soon as he saw the envelope, he exclaimed, I brought that in. I remember it very well. Where did you get it? Asked Larry eagerly. A man gave it to me last night, just as I was taking the mail from a box down near the river, was the unexpected reply. Chapter 18. Larry is baffled. This was much better than Larry had expected. To have the envelope remembered so soon was good, but to have the carrier who brought it in say he recalled having received it from the person who mailed the letter was better yet. What sort of a man was he? Asked Larry, his heart beating high with hope. Why do you ask? Inquired the carrier. I'm a reporter from the leader, and I'm trying to locate Mr. Potter, the missing millionaire, said Larry. This letter was from him. Then I can't be of much service to you, the postman went on. This was given to me by a man who bore no resemblance to Mr. Potter, whose picture I have lately seen in the papers. But what sort of a looking man gave you this envelope? Asked Larry. He was a smooth-shaven man, rather poorly dressed. I'll tell you how it was. This box, at which I was when the man gave me the letter, is at the foot of a street leading to the river. It is the last one I collect from at night. I had taken out all the mail in the box and was just locking it up again when someone came up the street in a hurry. I looked around, for the neighborhood is a lonely one, and as I did so, I saw a man come to a halt, as if he was surprised to see me at the box. I could see he had a letter in his hand. Come on, I said, for often people run up to me at the last minute to have me take letters. Come on, I said, for I was in a hurry. I'll take the letter. At that the man pulled his hat down over his eyes and advanced slowly. He held the letter out to me, and, as he did so, I caught a glimpse of his face as the light from a street lamp flashed on it. I could see he was smooth-shaven. I took the letter and put it in my bag. As I did, so the man seemed to melt away in the shadows. I thought it rather queer at the time, for it seemed as if the fellow was afraid I'd recognize him. But I'd never seen him before, so far as I know, so he needn't have been alarmed. I brought the letter to the office, and as I sorted my mail, I noted that the stamp had been stuck on with plenty of mucilage. I also saw the blot, and as the envelope was unlike any I had ever seen before, as far as size and quality of paper went, the thing was impressed on my mind. That's all I know about it, the carrier finished, but I'm sure the man who gave me the letter was not the missing millionaire. I've seen his picture too many times lately to be mistaken. Then who could it have been? Asked Larry. That's a hard question, young man, said the carrier. It might have been anyone else. I think it was a person who didn't care about being seen and didn't want to attract any attention. I guess he would have been better satisfied to have dropped the letter in the box when no one was looking, but seeing me there, he came up with it before he knew what he was doing. If the letter was from Mr. Potter, and it wasn't the millionaire who mailed it, he must have got someone to do it, the chief clerk of the substation suggested, and Larry was forced to adopt this idea. He inquired as to the location of the box at which the carrier stood when he received the missive and asked in what direction the man came from. Having learned these facts, and deciding he could gain nothing more by staying longer at the substation, Larry hurried to the leader office. Well, I've gained something, he said to himself. I've got a good story, and I have a slender clue to work on. I must write the story first, however. Then I'll go back and tell Grace what I learned. The account of the letter and the circumstances under which it was mailed created a new sensation in the Potter mystery, and, as on several other occasions, the leader scored a beat. As soon as he had finished the story, Larry went to see Grace, whom he found anxiously waiting for him. She asked a score of questions as to what he had learned, and the reporter told her all about his trip to the substation. What are you going to do next? She inquired. I think I'll go over on the east side and make some inquiries. Your father may be staying there, answered Larry. Going downtown in an elevated train and taking a stroll through that populous section, known as the East Side, Larry soon found himself in the neighborhood of the box at which the carrier had received the letter written by Mr. Potter. He took a brief survey of the locality. Not very promising, was his mental comment. All about were big tenement houses of a substantial kind. They were built of brick, and from nearly every window a woman's head protruded, while the streets swarmed with children. It was a neighborhood teeming with life, for it was the abode of the poor, and they were quartered together almost like rabbits in a warren. For want of something better to do, Larry strolled down one side of the street, at the end of which was located the letter box which formed such a slender clue. Then he walked up the other side, looking about him idly, in vain hopes of stumbling on something that would put him on the track. It was late in the afternoon, and the streets were beginning to fill with workers hurrying home, for the day's labor was over. As Larry strolled along, rather careless of his steps, he collided with a man in front of a big tenement building. "Excuse me," murmured the reporter. "I beg your pardon," the man said, grabbing hold of Larry to prevent them both from falling. So forceful had been the impact. "I was looking to see if my wife was watching for me. She generally looks out of the window to see me coming down the street, and then she puts the potatoes on. I guess I wasn't looking where I was going," said Larry, as he disengaged himself from the man's grip. Why, hello, Mr. Jackson," he exclaimed. "What? Why, bless my soul, if it isn't Larry Dexter," and the man held out his hand. "Why, I haven't seen you in a long time. How's your mother and the children?" "Fine. How's Mrs. Jackson?" "She's well. There she is looking out of the window, wondering why I don't come home to supper. You must come in and see her. Come and stay to supper." The man Larry had thus unexpectedly met was the one in whose flat Mrs. Dexter and the children had stayed the first night they had come to New York, and found that the sister of Larry's mother, with whom they expected to remain, had suddenly moved away. The Dexter family, sad and discouraged at the loss of their farm, would have fared badly on their arrival in the big city had not Mrs. Jackson and her husband befriended them. While Larry was getting a start in the newspaper work, the Dexter family had lived in the same tenement with the Jacksons, and they had become firm friends. Larry and his mother since then had moved to other quarters and had, for some time back, lost trace of their acquaintances. "I didn't know you lived here," said Larry when he had recovered somewhat from his surprise at seeing Mr. Jackson. "We haven't lived here long. I got a better position in this part of the city, and as I like to be near my work, I moved here." We like it quite well, but it's rather crowded. However, almost any place is in New York. But you must come in to supper. Mrs. Jackson will be anxious to hear all about your folks. I can see her making signs to me to hurry up. I suppose the potatoes are all cooked and the tea made. Larry did not require much urging to accept the kind invitation. He wanted to see his friends again, and he thought they might be able to give him some information concerning the people of the neighborhood, because it's the best place in the world to hide in. If I wanted to drop out of sight, I'd go about 2 blocks away from here and keep quiet. No one would ever think of looking for me so near my home. I hope you don't contemplate anything like that, said Larry with a laugh. No, indeed. But New York is the best hiding place, and you can depend on it. Mr. Potter is here. You haven't seen him in the neighborhood, have you? Asked the reporter, glad of the opportunity, which gave him a chance for that question. No, I can't say that I have. If they'd offer a reward, I might take time to hunt for him, and Mr. Jackson laughed. I can't afford to turn detective as it is now, he added. It's too hard to get a living. Larry spent the evening with his friends, keeping the talk as much as possible, without exciting suspicion, on the Potter case. In this way, he learned considerable about the persons living in the immediate vicinity of the Jacksons, for Mrs. Jackson was fond of making new acquaintances. But in all this there was no clue such as Larry sought. There were any number of men, concerning whom there seemed to be some mystery, but none answered the description of Mr. Potter. There are a queer lot of people in this tenement, said Mr. Jackson, during the course of the talking. All of them have some story hidden away, I guess. Especially one man. Who is he? Nobody knows, replied Mr. Jackson. He came here one night and seemed quite excited. Let's see, it was Thursday night, I remember now. He acted as though he was afraid someone was after him. Thursday night, thought Larry. That was the night the man got away from the deserted tenement. My wife and I were sitting here, continued Mr. Jackson, when all at once a knock sounded on the door. I opened it, and there was this man. He asked if I had any rooms to rent. I hadn't, but I told him I had a spare bed, for I saw he was respectable. He seemed glad to get it, and paid me well, though I didn't want to take the money. But he seemed to have plenty. What was queer about him? Asked Larry, beginning to take an unusual interest in what his friend was saying. Well, the excitement he seemed to be in, for one thing. In another, he had just been shaved. I could see the talcum powder on his cheeks. I thought it strange that a man who had time to shave or get shaved should be in such a hurry. But it wasn't any of my affair, so I said nothing. What became of him? Larry was quite eager now. He seemed to be on the verge of discovering something. If not of the Potter mystery, then of the other, that cropped up every now and again, that of the man he had helped save from the wreck. He went away the next morning, Mr. Jackson resumed. I didn't see him again until the next night. Then he told me he had a room in this tenement. Where? Inquired the young reporter. On the floor below. A front room, at the end of the corridor. But are you going to call on him? And Mr. Jackson looked somewhat surprised at Larry's eagerness. Maybe I could get a story out of him, replied the reporter non-committally. Have to be always on the lookout, you know. Well, I guess you'll not get much out of this man, said Mr. Jackson. He hardly speaks to me, though he doesn't seem cross or ugly. Only there's some mystery about him. I'm sure of that. If he's reeto, I'm positive there is, thought Larry. And it looks as if it might be that fellow. Not wishing to seem too keen on the scent of the queer man, the newspaper youth changed the subject. In a little while he said he had better be going home, as he had not told his mother he would be out late. He promised to ask Mrs. Dexter to call on Mrs. Jackson, and with many good wishes from his friends, he left. Now for a try at the room on the next floor, said Larry in a whisper, as he found himself in the corridor. It's only a slim chance, but a reporter has to take all that come his way. He found the room Mr. Jackson had described and knocked on the door. There was a sound from within, as though someone had arisen from a chair. Then a voice asked, "Who's there?" "Does reeto live here?" asked Larry, determining on a bold plan. Hardly had he spoken the words when the door was quickly opened. Chapter 19. Grace on the Trail. Larry saw, standing before him, framed in the doorway from which streamed the glare from a big reading lamp, the man of mystery, the fellow who had escaped from the tumble-down tenement, the man he and Bailey had pulled ashore on the life raft. "Are you reeto?" asked Larry again, rather at a loss for something to say, when he saw the strange man confronting him. The mysterious one looked at Larry for several seconds. He seemed much excited and in doubt as to what to do. Then, seeming to arrive at a sudden decision, he quickly closed the door, and Larry heard the key turned in the lock. "Not much satisfaction in that," muttered the young reporter. "That was him, though. I wonder what I had better do." Larry stood in the hallway, undecided. He wanted another opportunity to see and speak to the man he believed was reeto, but he considered it would not be wise to knock again on the door. The occupant of the room either would not answer or would order him away. "I'll have to come again," Larry said to himself. "I've learned one thing, anyhow, and that is where he lives." The young reporter went to the office of the leader early the next morning. He found Mr. Imberg on hand and told the city editor the plans for the day, that of making a tour of the steamship piers. Mr. Imberg thought this was a good idea and complimented Larry on his work thus far. "I ran across my old friend, the East Indian, last night," Larry said as he was leaving. "I'm going to work him up for a story when I get through with this Potter case." "Don't do it until then," advised Mr. Imberg. "I want you to devote all your attention to the missing millionaire. The East Indian story will not amount to much, or I'd put another man on it. You may get a yarn for the Saturday supplement out of it, but even that's doubtful." Larry thought differently, but he did not say so, nor did he mention that he was going to take Grace Potter with him on his tour of the docks. He had an idea that the city editor might object or laugh at him, and Larry did not care to have that happen. He felt he was doing right, and he knew there could be no serious objection to the daughter of the missing man aiding in a search for her parent. Larry found Grace waiting for him. She was quietly dressed and wore a heavy veil, so that no one in the street would recognize her, since her picture had been published in several papers, and there might be comments from the crowd if the daughter of Mr. Potter was seen out in company of a newspaper reporter. "Anything new?" asked the young lady, for she had taken to greeting Larry in that newspaper fashion. "Not much. I didn't learn anything of consequence by my trip to the east side last night. I'm not done there, however. Now we'll try the piers and see what sort of a pull you have with the captains of the vessels." "We may not find many captains," Grace said, "unless their ships are about to sail. Still, it is worth trying. Shall we start?" "I'm ready any time you are," Larry answered. "What did your mother say?" "She objected a bit at first, but I soon convinced her it was for the best." Larry thought it would not have been hard for Grace to have convinced him that almost anything was for the best. She looked quite trim in her dark dress, with her glossy hair held snugly in place by her veil. As they went down the steps of the mansion, Larry saw a man, who was standing on the other side of the street, move rapidly away, as if he had been watching the house. The young reporter uttered an exclamation before he was aware of it, and Grace quickly asked, "What's the matter?" I saw someone," Larry replied. "Anyone would think it was a ghost from the way you act," the girl went on, with a little laugh. She was in much better spirits than any time since her father had disappeared, for the chance of helping to search for him, and the change from sitting idly in the house waiting for news, was a welcome relief. "No, it wasn't a ghost. It was a man I'd like to have a chance to talk to," Larry went on. "Would he give you a story? Is that what you call it?" "That's right. Yes, I believe he could give me a story," and Larry looked in the direction the man had gone. He was no longer to be seen. "A very good story," he added, for the man was the same one he had surprised in the tenement the night before, the man of the life raft. However, he could not leave Grace to go in search of the strange individual, and it was more important, as Mr. Imberg had said, to stick to the Potter case. The other could wait. "All the same, I'd like to know what he was doing in this neighborhood," thought Larry. He puzzled over the matter for several seconds as he and Grace went along. On the way downtown, the two discussed their plans. There were not many Italian steamship lines to visit, but it might take some time to see the captains of all the boats at present in port. Some of the commanders would be at their hotels pending the loading of their vessels. "Have you made up your mind what you want to ask them?" inquired Larry, as they were nearing the station where they intended to get off. "What I want principally to know is if a person answering my father's description came over with them lately. I want to find out, in case he did, how he acted, and if he gave any hint of being in trouble. That may be a good clue to follow," Larry said. "Now we'll make our first attempt." It ended in failure, for though they found the captain of the Italian steamer they boarded in the cabin of his vessel, he could not aid them. He was very polite about it, and seemed quite sorry that he could be of no service. It was the same in a number of other cases. Some of the captains remembered Grace, for she had crossed with them once or twice. But none of them recalled a man answering Mr. Potter's description making the voyage with them recently. The last place they visited was the dock of the line to which the wrecked Olivia belonged. This line Grace had never traveled on, but she had a letter of introduction to the manager from the captain of the Messina, on which she had made her last trip. The commanders of 2 steamers of this company were in port. One of them was at the dock, for his vessel was about to sail. To him Grace made her inquiries, but fruitlessly. She turned away, rather disappointed. There was but one more chance left. The other captain was at his hotel, not far away, for seamen like to remain near the waterfront. "We'll go there," said Larry, "and then I must get back to the office and write my story for today's paper." "I wish you had some better news," spoke Grace. "But I am afraid Captain Peduzzi, whom we are now going to see, will prove as disappointing as the rest." "We'll hope for the best," remarked Larry. "I wish." But what he wished he never told, for at that instant his attention was attracted by a voice. It was that of a man who stood at the small window of the steamship office. The window was one which he and Grace had just stepped away from, after inquiring as to where Captain Peduzzi's hotel was. If the voice attracted Larry, the sight of the man himself did more to rivet his attention. For the first glance showed him the inquirer was none other than the mysterious individual, Reeto. "I would like to inquire where I can find Captain Trella of the steamer Olivia," the man asked of the clerk. "The Olivia is lost," replied the steamship clerk. "I know it, but I would like to see the captain. He was saved, I believe." "Yes, he was. He commands a freight ship now. She's due in port in a few days. The Turtle is her name. You can come around when she gets in." The mysterious man turned away as though disappointed. As he did so, he caught sight of Larry, and instantly he hurried out of the office. Larry was greatly excited. He was convinced, more than ever, that there was something in this man's actions that made him an object of suspicion. He felt that he must follow the fellow, but he could not leave Grace. He looked around for her, but she had gone to the ladies' dressing room to adjust her veil and hat, which had been blown about by the high wind. She came back presently, to find Larry much agitated. "What is the matter?" she asked. "Nothing much," replied Larry. "I just saw my queer stranger again, and—" "You'd like to follow him, and you don't want to leave me," put in Grace with quick wit. "Now run right along. I can go to that hotel all by myself and see Captain Peduzzi. I'm not a bit afraid. I once traveled from London to Paris alone. You hurry after him, and I'll see the captain. I'll telephone you the result of my interview. You can come up and see me this evening, and we'll talk over some more plans." "That will be good," Larry said. "But are you sure you won't mind me leaving you?" "I can get along all right," replied Grace. "Of course I'd like to have you come along, for I believe you understand this matter better than I do. But I want you to find that other man and get your story." Larry was inclined both ways, but he knew it would be better to hurry after Reeto, as Grace could make all the necessary inquiries of Captain Peduzzi. "Until tonight, then," the young reporter said, as he hurried out of the steamship office, and Grace turned to go to the captain's hotel. Reaching the street, Larry saw, some distance ahead of him, the form of the man whose actions so puzzled him, and who had led him such a baffling chase. "Here is where I get you," thought Larry, as he hurried on. Chapter 20. Larry Gets a Scare. Through the crowded street the young reporter ran, bumping into several persons, and causing them to mutter more or less impolite exclamations about youths who trod on the toes of innocent pedestrians. Larry could catch occasional glimpses of his man, and he noted that Reeto looked back every now and then to see if he was being followed. "Oh, I'm after you, my East Indian friend," Larry remarked to himself. "I'm going to have an accounting with you now. There's something queer about you." No sooner had Larry given expression to this last sentence, speaking somewhat aloud, as was his habit when thinking intently, than he slipped on a banana peeling and fell down with a force that jarred him all over. "I'll have to be more careful," thought Larry, as he got up and found that no bones were broken. He started off again after Reeto. "I wasn't looking where I was going, thinking so much of Reeto. Where is he now? He must have got quite a way ahead." He had, so far that Larry could no longer see him. The reporter tried to peer through the ever-shifting crowd for a glimpse of Reeto, but with no success. He's gone, he murmured. However, I know where he lives, and I'll go there at once. No, I've got to get a story in for today's paper about Mr. Potter. I haven't much time before the first edition. Guess I'd better telephone it in, and let Mr. Imberg have one of the men fix it up. In his eagerness to catch reeto, Larry had rather lost sight of his more important duties, and as he looked at his watch, he found he had no time to spare if the leader was to have a story that day. He looked for the blue sign, indicating a public telephone station, and saw one a few doors down the street. On his way there, he ran over in his mind the points of the story. It would be based on the search and inquiry among the steamship captains. I've got to say it resulted in nothing, Larry remarked to himself. Hold on, though. Suppose Grace gets a clue from Captain Peduzzi? I'll be in a pretty mess if she does, and I telephone and that we found out nothing. Wish I hadn't chased after that East Indian. I should have stayed with Grace until we got through. No help for it, though. So here goes. I wish I'd done as Mr. Imberg said and let the reeto matter drop. But it seemed too good to lose sight of. He soon had the leader office on the wire, and a few seconds later was talking to Mr. Imberg. He was rather surprised at what the city editor said. What's the matter with you, Larry? Was the inquiry that came through the telephone. We've been waiting for you. Have you seen the scorcher? No. Why? Asked Larry, an uneasy feeling coming over him. There seemed an atmosphere of beat about him, and he was afraid of Mr. Imberg's next words. Why, they've got a big story about Mr. Potter being home, went on the city editor. They say he is concealed in the house, and has been ever since the scare. That's not true, replied Larry. I was at the house this morning, and he wasn't home. I've been all around the steamer piers and got no trace of him. I just left his daughter, and she would know if he had been home all this while. Well, they've got the story, repeated Mr. Imberg, with the insistence that city editors sometimes use when they fear their reporters have been beaten. I sent Harvey up to the house in a hurry to make inquiries. The scorcher got out an extra. Where have you been? I just finished the tour of the docks. Well, you'd better go up to the house and make sure. It looks queer. I'll bet that story came from Sullivan, said Larry. He's sore on us and would do anything to get even. He wants to find Mr. Potter, you know. I hope you're right. And Mr. Imberg's voice was not as cordial as it usually was. Let me hear from you soon again. I'll have one of the men fix up something for the first edition. You tell him about the inquiries made of the ship captains. Larry's heart was like lead. To have worked so hard, and then to have another paper come out with a scare story about Mr. Potter's return was discouraging. That story's a fake, he decided, as he prepared a telephone in the result of his morning's work. I'll prove it is too, and make them take back water. Larry's story of the trip to the steamship offices was not very interesting reading, for it was but a record of failure. He realized that, but there was nothing else to print, and the paper had to have something. It was not Larry's fault, for even a reporter on a special assignment cannot provide fresh and startling news every day, though all newspapermen try hard enough for this desirable end. After Larry had telephoned in all the information he had, he hurried uptown to the Potter house. He found Grace had just come in, and, to Larry's relief, she had not been successful in getting any news from Captain Peduzzi. In a few words, the reporter told what the scorcher had printed. "We must deny that at once," exclaimed Grace. "I wonder why they print such untruths." "For one reason, because the scorcher is trying to live up to its name and give the public hot news," replied Larry, "and for another, because Sullivan has some end to gain. He stands in with the scorcher men, and I think my old enemy, Peter Manton, is responsible for this." "What can you do to offset it?" asked Grace. "I can have a signed statement from you or your mother in our last edition." "A signed statement?" "Yes, a little interview with you, in the form of a communication, with your name at the foot, denying that your father is at home. This will take the wind out of the scorcher's sails. Then I'll give you the interview at once." "What shall I say?" Larry told her, and in a few minutes the message was being dictated over the Potter telephone to Mr. Imberg. "I'm glad to hear this, Larry," the city editor said. "We had quite a scare. I thought they had you beaten, even though Harvey came back and said Mrs. Potter sent down word there was no truth in the scorcher yard. You certainly had us scared. I was frightened myself," admitted Larry with a laugh. "This will make story enough for today, unless you find Mr. Potter," Mr. Imberg went on. "Now lay pipes for something for tomorrow." "I will," Larry replied, though he did not in the least know what new features he could play up. At that instant the bell rang, and a whistle indicated that the letter carrier was at the door. Grace answered it. She came back on the run, a missive in her hand. "It's from my father," she exclaimed as she tore open the envelope. Larry watched Grace while she read the letter. It was short, for she had quickly finished with it and turned to the reporter. "He's written about you," she exclaimed. "About me?" "Yes." "Listen," and Grace read. "I am well. Still have to remain away. Don't try to find me. We'll be home soon. Tell Larry Dexter to give up. He's chasing me too close." "Chasing him too close," exclaimed Larry in bewilderment. "I only wish I was. I haven't the least clue to his whereabouts. I wonder what he means? Is that his writing?" "I can't be mistaken in that," Grace replied. "It is just the same as the other letter was. Let me see," and the young reporter examined the envelope. It was similar to that containing the first note which had come from Mr. Potter, save there was no blot on it, and the stamp showed no excess of mucilage. "I'll take this to the substation," Larry went on. "It was probably mailed in the same place as was the other. I'll see if the carrier had any such experience as he did with the former note." "I think it would be a good plan," Grace answered. "Oh, this is beginning to wear on my nerves. As for Mother, she is almost ill over it. Her physician says if Father is not found soon, he cannot say what will happen to Mother. Still, she must know your father is safe. That is the worst of it. She will not believe these notes are from him. Or, rather, she believes he is held captive somewhere and is forced to write them. Nothing I can say will make her think differently. She is wearing herself to a shadow over it." "We must do something," exclaimed Larry. "Yes, but what?" asked the girl. "You are working hard and I am doing all I can, but our efforts seem to amount to nothing. What more can we do?" "I'm trying to think of a plan," Larry responded. "The search of the steamship piers gave us no clue. The police here have not been able to find a trace. We can try one thing more." "What is that?" "You can hire private detectives. Sometimes, in cases of this kind, they are better than the police, as they assign one man, who devotes all his attention to the search, while the police, as a rule, don't bother much to find missing persons." "Then I'll hire the best private detectives to be had," exclaimed Grace. "Where ought I to go?" Larry named an agency that he had heard was first class and offered to take Grace to the office. The reporter knew one of the men on the staff, as he had once written a story in which he figured, and the officer had been grateful for the mention of his name. Detectives, even private ones, are prone to vanity in this respect, as a rule. "I don't like to take up so much of your time," objected the girl, as Larry prepared to go with her to the detective agency. "My time is yours in this case. I have nothing to do for the leader but to find your father. This is part of the work. I wouldn't think it could pay a newspaper to put one man exclusively on a case like this. The editors think it does. In the first place, it makes some news every day, and the papers have to have news. Then if I should happen to find Mr. Potter, it would be a big advertisement for the leader, and that is what all the New York papers are looking for. The better advertised they are, the better prices they can charge for the advertisements printed in them, for it's from the advertisements that a newspaper makes its money. Besides, I've promised to find your father for you, and I'm going to do it." Larry looked very determined. I never supposed newspaper work was so complicated," said Grace with a little sigh. "Now let's go to the detectives. I'm almost afraid. It sounds so awful to say detective." Larry found the man he knew in the office of the agency, and the latter introduced him to the chief. The reporter explained the reason for the visit, and Grace added a plea that they do all in their power to locate Mr. Potter. "I thought you'd come here sooner or later," said the chief with a smile. "Most folks do when they find the regular police don't give enough attention to the cases. It's not the fault of the police, though. They have so much to do they can't give much time to a single case. But of course we can. Now then, tell me all about it," which Grace, aided by Larry, proceeded to do. The chief listened intently and asked several questions. He took the 2 letters which Grace had from her father and looked carefully at them. "Do you think you'll be able to do anything?" asked the girl anxiously. The strain was beginning to tell heavily on her. "Of course we will," exclaimed the chief, heartily. "We'll find your father for you. You can depend on it." Larry did not want to tell her that the chief was thus optimistic in regard to every case he undertook. It was a habit of his, not a bad one, perhaps, and it did little harm, for nearly all of his clients wanted cheering up. "What do you think about this, young man?" asked the chief, turning suddenly to Larry. "In regard to what, Mr. Grover? Where do you think Mr. Potter is? I understand you've been working on this case. In fact, I have all your stories clipped from the leader." Larry had not forgotten about reeto, and he determined to pay the fellow another visit. With him, to think was to act. He soon found himself going up the stairs of the tenement house, and presently reached reeto's door. His knock brought no response, and he stood for a moment, undecided what to do. Then a bold idea came to him. "I'll try the door and see if he's home," he said. "If he isn't, there's no harm done. If he is, I can explain it somehow." Larry, after a moment's hesitation to listen for any possible movement on the other side of the portal, tried the door. It opened easily for him, though it needed but a glance to show that the apartment was empty and vacated. All the furniture was gone. "He's skipped," exclaimed Larry, as he struck a match and looked around. "I guess he was afraid I'd find him. Well, I am more determined than ever that I'll land this man. I wonder if he left any clues behind?" He lighted a jet of a wall fixture, for the gas had not been shut off. In the glare, he saw a scrap of paper lying on the floor. He picked it up. As he glanced at it, he gave a cry of astonishment. "Who would have thought it?" exclaimed Larry to himself. "Of all the strange things, I wonder I didn't connect him with the case before. This explains why he was in front of the house. For the paper he had picked up was part of an envelope like those which had contained the letters Grace received from her father. And on the scrap was her name, but the envelope had been spoiled by a blot of ink in writing the address. It had been torn up and thrown away, to remain a mute bit of evidence. "Reeto knows Mr. Potter," exclaimed Larry. "Reeto is the man who mailed the letters for the missing millionaire. If I find him, I can make him tell me where Mr. Potter is. Now to trace my mysterious East Indian friend." Chapter 21. Tracing Reeto. Larry took another survey of the apartment to see if there were any more clues that might aid him. But the one that had so unexpectedly come to his hand was all he found. The place showed evidences of having been hastily vacated. "I'll see Mr. Jackson," he decided. "Perhaps he can tell me something." He was interested in this queer man. He lost no time in going to the rooms of his friends. They were glad to see him and asked a number of questions about his mother, sisters, and brother. But Larry, as soon as he could, turned the subject to reeto. "He's gone," he told Mr. Jackson. "I suppose he had. I saw the janitor taking his things from the room this morning." "Do you know where he went to?" asked the young reporter eagerly. "I want to find him. I haven't the least idea. I wonder if the janitor would know," Larry went on. "He might. Perhaps the man left his address with him, in order that letters might be forwarded. I'll go downstairs with you and introduce you to the janitor." That functionary was unable to throw any light on where reeto had gone. Evidently, for the time being, the chase had come to an end. Larry made his way to the nearest elevated station and rode in the direction of the Potter home. He had no definite plan in mind, and more from a whim than anything else, he decided to walk past the house. He did not expect it, but he had an idea, a very faint one, that he might see Grace. Of course, if he saw her at the window, where she sometimes sat, it would be no more than polite to go in and tell her what the carrier had said about the second letter. When Larry got in front of the Potter house, he was disappointed to see that it was in darkness. It was about 10 o'clock, and he knew the family was in the habit of retiring early, especially since Mr. Potter's disappearance. As he strolled past on the other side of the street, looking in vain for a glimmer of light or the sight of a girlish face against the window pane, he passed into the deep shadow cast by a big tree on which shone an electric arc light in front of the Potter house. The blackness was quite deep, in contrast to the illumination on both sides of the tree, for electric lamps have the property of casting dense shadows. If Larry had been looking straight in front of him, perhaps it would not have happened, but he was staring at where Grace lived, and the first thing he knew, he had walked full tilt into a man who was hiding in the darkness behind the big tree. "Oh, ugh," grunted Larry, for the breath was knocked from his body by the sudden impact. "What's the matter? What are you doing?" inquired the man angrily. "Why don't you look where you're going?" The collision had swung him out of the shadow into the light, where he stood blinking. Larry recovered his breath, and then, at the sight of the man, gave a low-voiced cry of astonishment. "Mr. Sullivan," he exclaimed. "Oh, it's you, is it, Dexter?" remarked the politician. "Are you following me? Are you spying on me? If you're, I'll have you arrested." "I'm not following you or spying on you," retorted Larry. "But you seem to be hiding here. What do you want? What are you in front of Mr. Potter's house for?" He was determined to follow up his advantage and to show Sullivan that he was not in the least intimidated by him. Clearly, there was something in the wind when the district political leader was hiding behind trees watching the house of the missing millionaire. "Look here," exclaimed Sullivan, and he had moved back until he was in the shadow. "You go along and mind your own business. Do you hear? Move along now. I guess I have as good a right as you have to remain on the street. And this sidewalk is just as public as any in New York, even if it is in the millionaire section. What are you hiding for? Do you expect to see Mr. Potter come walking down the steps? If you do, I'll wait too. I'd like to see him." "You think you're very smart because you're a reporter," retorted Sullivan, becoming more and more angry as he saw he could not intimidate Larry. "Let me tell you, you're making a big mistake. I have some power in New York, and I warn you that I'll use it if you don't stop interfering with me. You've made me trouble enough. Now you be off, or I'll call a policeman and have you arrested." "You can't," replied Larry. "I haven't done anything except to run into you, and that was an accident caused by you being in the shadow. I'll show you what I can do. The police of this district know me, and they'll do anything I say." "You might have pull enough to have me arrested," Larry admitted, "but I wouldn't stay locked up long. A telephone message to the city editor of the leader and a word from him to someone higher up than a policeman would bring about a change. And I don't think you'd like to read the story in the paper the next day, Mr. Sullivan." The politician was silent. He knew Larry had the best of the argument. For though the assembly leader had some power in New York, he was only a small fry when it came to an important matter, such as he knew would result if Larry was taken into custody. He contented himself, therefore, with growling out threats against Larry in particular and all newspaper men in general. "You'll interfere with me once too often," said Sullivan. "I warn you, young man, you're making a big mistake. There's more behind this matter than you have any idea of." "I know there is," replied Larry quickly. "That's why I'm working so hard to clear up the mystery. I want to find out what your part is in the disappearance of Mr. Potter." "My part? What do you mean?" "You know well enough what I mean. You are interested in Mr. Potter. You want him to come back. Now what for? Has it anything to do with the new line? Does it concern your friends, Kilburn and Riley? That's what I want to know, and what I'm going to find out. You're playing a deep game, Mr. Sullivan, but I'll beat you at it." Larry was quite surprised at his own eloquence and the manner in which he bid defiance to the leader of the assembly district. "Hush!" exclaimed the politician. "If you say another word, I'll knock you down." And he advanced toward Larry as though he intended to carry the threat into execution. "Keep quiet, I say." "Are you afraid of having the truth told?" asked Larry, speaking a little louder. It seemed that Sullivan was worried lest someone might overhear the talk. The streets, however, were deserted at this time. "Never you mind," retorted Sullivan. "You've said enough, so that I'll not forget it in a hurry. And Jack Sullivan is a bad man to have for an enemy. Let me tell you, I don't doubt that, but I'm not afraid of you. I believe you know something of Mr. Potter's disappearance, and I'm going to find out what it is. You are waiting here with some object in view, and I'm going to discover it." "Get away from here," ordered Sullivan, hardly able to speak because of his anger. "I'm going to stay as long as I like." "Move on," exclaimed the politician. "Get away, or—" He emerged from the shadow and approached Larry. The man's face showed how wrought up he was, and though he was not much taller or stronger than Larry, he had a man's energy and would prove more than a match for the lad if it came to a fight. And it looked now as though he was going to resort to desperate measures in order to accomplish his ends. "I'm going to stay until I see what you're up to," said Larry firmly, bracing himself to meet the expected attack. Sullivan doubled up his fists and drew nearer to the youth. He raised his arm, as though to strike. The two were beyond the shadow of the tree now, and in plain view. Sullivan's fist shot out, but Larry was watching and cleverly dodged it. The politician overreached himself, lost his balance, and his fist meeting nothing more solid than air, he pitched forward and fell on the sidewalk. Larry swung around, ready to meet his opponent when he should come back to the attack. At that instant, a window in a house across the street opened, and a voice the young reporter knew was Grace's called. "Larry! Larry! Come here!" He started to run across the thoroughfare, but as he did so, he saw another man emerge from behind a tree, next to the one where Sullivan had been concealed. And as the light from an arc lamp gleamed on this man's face, Larry saw it was that of reeto. The young reporter paused, undecided what to do. Across the street, he could see Grace in the raised window, waiting for him, for what he did not know. But even as he looked at her, he saw reeto running off down the street. In an instant, Larry's mind was made up. He took after reeto as fast as he could run. Chapter 22. Grace is suspicious. Reeto headed for Central Park, and as Larry saw him pass the entrance, he realized that it was going to be as hard to follow the man as though he had disappeared in the midst of a crowd, especially since the park was not well lighted. "But I've got to follow him," thought Larry. "It's my best chance. I must find out where he has moved to. I wonder what Grace wanted, and I wonder what Sullivan's game was. But the questions are coming too thick for me. I'll have to get an assistant." By this time, he had entered the park. Ahead of him, he could hear the running feet of the man he was pursuing. The big recreation ground was almost deserted. "I don't believe he dare run very fast," reasoned Larry, as he slackened his pace. "If he does, a policeman will be sure to stop him and ask questions, and I guess reeto will not relish that. I have a better chance than I thought at first. After all, I don't see why he is so afraid of me. All I want to do is to ask him where he gets the letters from Mr. Potter. He must know where the millionaire is hiding, and it looks as if Mr. Potter had been in reeto's room at the Jackson tenement. Or else how would the envelope get there? That's it. I'll bet the missing millionaire has been hiding with this East Indian chap. I never thought of that until now." Having walked for fully a quarter of a mile, reeto came to a sudden stop, and so did Larry, hiding in the shadow of a tree. Reeto listened intently, and of course, heard no pursuing footsteps. This apparently satisfied him, for he proceeded more slowly. "He thinks I've given up the chase," thought Larry. "I'll let him. Maybe he'll go home all the quicker, and after I learn where he is stopping, I can go back and see what Grace wanted." Larry's surmise proved correct, and his wish soon came to pass. The man, evidently believing that he was safe, emerged from the park to the street, for the whole pursuit had gone on not far from the thoroughfare, and just within the boundary of the city's breathing spot. Larry, keeping in the shadows, watched him. He saw reeto give one more cautious look around, and then, crossing the highway, enter a hotel nearby. It was a fashionable one, and Larry wondered how the man, who had hitherto only lived in tenements, could afford to engage rooms in such a place as this. "Maybe he's only doing it to throw me off the track," the reporter reasoned. "I'll just wait a while and see if he comes out." He waited nearly an hour, hiding in the shadows of the park and keeping close watch on the entrance to the hotel. He did not see reeto emerge, and then he decided on a new plan. "I'll inquire if he is stopping there," he said to himself. "If he is, I'll wait until tomorrow before acting. I'll let him think everything's all right. It's the best way." Sauntering into the hotel lobby, he found no one but the night clerk on duty, though there were a few sleepy bellboys sprawled on a bench. As soon as the clerk saw Larry approaching the desk, he swung the registry book around and, dipping a pen in the ink, extended it to the reporter. "I didn't come to stay," said Larry with a smile. "I want to inquire if there is a Mr. reeto stopping here." "There is," replied the clerk. "Would you like to see him? He just came in a little while ago." "No, not tonight," Larry replied, his heart beating high with hope. He had run down his man. "I wasn't sure of his address, and I thought I'd inquire. I'll call and see him tomorrow." The clerk, having lost all interest as soon as he found Larry was not to be a guest of the hotel, did not reply. The bellboys, seeing their visions of a tip disappearing, resumed their dozes, and Larry walked out. He was impressed by the clerk's manner. Clearly, reeto was a man of means, and not as poor as Larry had supposed. "So far, so good," he murmured. "Now to go back and see what Grace wanted. That is, if it isn't too late." It was nearly 11 o'clock, but Larry had an idea that Grace would still be up. It was rather an unusual hour to make a call. Still, all the circumstances in this case were unusual, and Larry did not think Grace would mind. He saw a light in the Potter house as he approached it. Thinking perhaps Sullivan might be in the vicinity, Larry walked up and down on the other side of the street, peering in the shadow of the tree where he had had his encounter with the politician. But Sullivan had evidently gone away. "Why didn't you come when I called you?" asked Grace, as she admitted Larry to the library. "I wanted to," the young reporter replied, "but I had to take after a person who I believe knows where your father is, and I couldn't stop without losing sight of him." "I have some news for you." "And I have some for you," exclaimed Grace. "Let me tell mine first." "All right," agreed Larry with a smile. "Go ahead." "Well, I was sitting in the window tonight, looking out on the street, and feeling particularly sad and lonely on account of Father, when I saw a man sneaking along on the other side. I saw him hide behind a tree, and I resolved to keep watch. There have been some burglaries in this neighborhood recently, and I wasn't sure whether he was a thief or a detective sent here to watch for suspicious characters. Well, as I sat there watching, I saw you come along and talk to the man behind the tree. How long had he been there when I came along?" "Oh, for some time, but don't interrupt, please. You can ask questions afterward. When I saw you talking to the man, I knew it must be all right, and I was beginning to think he was a detective. Then I noticed another man sneaking along. He, too, hid behind a tree next to the first man. I thought this was queer until I remembered you told me that detectives usually hunt in couples, and I thought he was another officer from headquarters. I thought so until Mother, who, it seems, had been looking out of her window in the front room upstairs, called to me. She asked me if I had seen the two men come along, and when I said I had, she wanted to know if I didn't think there was something queer about the second man. I said I didn't notice particularly, but just then the man stepped out into the light, and I had a good look at him. Was there anything suspicious about him?" "There certainly was," exclaimed Grace earnestly. "As soon as I saw him, I thought sure it was my father. He had his back toward me, and he looked exactly like Papa. Mother saw it too, and she cried out. Just then the man turned, and I saw he was smooth-shaven, and his face didn't look a bit like my father's. Then I saw you and that other man, Mr. Sullivan. I then knew him to be step into the light. I saw he was going to hit you, and I raised the window and called. I wanted to ask you to see who the second man was, the one who looked so much like my father. I called, but you didn't seem to hear. I heard you, replied Larry, but I couldn't stop. I wanted to take after the man, the same man you were suspicious of. I traced him through the park. Did you find him? Who is he? Where is he? Is he? Oh, Larry, don't keep me in suspense. I'm sorry to have to tell you he isn't your father, Larry replied, gently, as he saw the girl's distress. But I think he knows where your father is. He goes by the name of Reeto, and I helped save him from the wreck of a vessel on the Jersey coast. See, I found this in his room, a little while before he disappeared, and he held out to Grace the torn envelope with her name on it. My father's writing, she exclaimed. Larry heard someone descending the stairs and coming toward the library. Chapter 23. Captain Trella arrives. Grace, what is the matter? Exclaimed a woman's voice, and looking up Larry saw Mrs. Potter. Nothing, Mother, replied the girl. This is Mr. Larry Dexter. He just brought me some news. Oh, Mother, that wasn't Papa we saw out in the street. I knew it, dear, as soon as I saw his face. Larry felt rather uncomfortable, for Mrs. Potter and Grace showed signs of emotion. I was telling your daughter, he said to Mrs. Potter, that I think I have located the man who knows where your husband is. Oh, I hope you have, exclaimed Mrs. Potter. This suspense is awful. Who is he? Where is he? Larry related the circumstances of his chase after Reeto, telling how he had located the man at the hotel. I'll go and see him tomorrow, he said, before he has a chance to get away. He does not suspect that I know where he is. Why not go now? Asked Mrs. Potter. I'm afraid he would see no one tonight. It is very late, and he would suspect something if anyone sent up word they wanted to see him. He would at once connect it with the chase I had after him. But I think I fooled him. I'm sure he can clear up this matter in a short time, once I get in a conversation with him. I'll go with you, said Grace, with sudden energy. I will make him tell where my father is. Larry thought he could best deal with Reeto alone, but he did not want to tell Grace so. However, her mother got him out of what might have been an embarrassing position. I'd rather you wouldn't go, Grace, she said. There is no telling what sort of a person this Reeto is. His name sounds foreign. They talked for some time about the curious circumstances connected with the disappearance of the millionaire, and when a clock struck the hour of 1, Larry arose with a start. "I had no idea it was so late," he exclaimed. "I must hurry home, or Mother will be worried. I will call tomorrow and let you know what success I have." "Do, please," said Mrs. Potter. "And come early," added Grace, as she accompanied Larry to the door. "Don't let that horrid man stab you with an East Indian poison dagger," she went on with a little laugh, as she got out of hearing of her mother. Larry promised, and then hurried off down the street to the nearest elevated railway station. He was up early the next morning and wrote out the story of the day's events, including the encounter with Sullivan and the chase after Reeto. He touched as lightly as possible on his own and Grace's parts in the affair, but there was enough to make interesting reading, and he knew no other paper would have it. "This is good stuff, Larry," complimented Mr. Imberg when the reporter had turned his story in at the desk. "What next?" "I'm going to see Reeto," was the answer. "I'll make him tell where Mr. Potter is." "You were right about your East Indian friend," admitted the city editor. "I had no idea there was a story like this connected with him, least of all that it concerned the missing millionaire. Keep right after him. Let us hear from you in time for the first edition. Whatever you learn from Reeto will make the leading part of today's account." "I'll telephone in," said Larry, as he hurried from the city room. Larry anticipated meeting with some difficulty in getting Reeto to talk. He knew the man must have a strong motive for aiding Mr. Potter. Probably the millionaire was paying him well to serve him, to mail letters occasionally, and keep him informed as to how the search for him was progressing. "There are lots of ends to this that I don't understand," said Larry to himself as he was on his way to the hotel where the mysterious man was stopping. "This mystery seemed to start with the wrecking of the Olivia, yet I don't see how I can connect Mr. Potter with that. He must have met Reeto in New York after the rescued men came here. Maybe I'm wrong in thinking Mr. Potter is in New York now. He may be some distance off and depending on Reeto to look after his interests. If that's so, it would explain why the East Indian was hanging around the house. He wanted to see that Grace and her mother were well, so he could report to the millionaire. Yet if that was so, I can't see how Mr. Potter could write in the letter, as he did, that I was getting too close to him. Yes, there's something very strange in all this, but maybe it will soon be cleared up." Thus Larry hoped, but he was doomed to disappointment. For when he inquired at the hotel desk for Mr. Reeto and said he would like to see him, the clerk replied, "Mr. Reeto left early this morning. He gave up his room. I don't know where he went. I've got it all to do over again," the young reporter thought as he strolled out into the street. "I'll never have such luck again. If he watches the house after this, he'll do it in a way that won't give me a chance to catch him. Well, I got to go back and tell Grace I made a fizzle of it. Too bad, when they're hoping so much on the result of this visit." Larry purchased a morning paper from a newsboy on the street and glanced at it idly as he strolled along. His eye lighted on the column devoted to shipping news, and almost unconsciously, he saw among the arrivals the turtle of an Italian line. At once a train of thought was started in his mind. "The turtle," he mused, "that's the freight ship that Captain Trella, formerly of the Olivia, commands. That's the Captain Reeto was inquiring about the day Grace and I made the tour of the steamer offices. I wanted to meet him. Well, Captain Trella is in now. I wonder if Reeto could have left the hotel to go and see him." Larry puzzled over it for a few minutes. Several ideas came to him, but they were confused, and he did not know which line to follow. Why should Reeto want to see Captain Trella? He asked himself. Is it possible that Reeto is a criminal and had to escape from the sinking ship? It looks so. But if he has done something that would necessitate him keeping out of the way, how can he aid Mr. Potter? It's too deep for me, but I know what I'll do. I'll go and see Captain Trella. He'll remember me, for I interviewed him about the wreck. I'll ask him who Reeto is. He'll know him, for he was probably one of the first cabin passengers. That's what I'll do. I think I'm on the right track now. Chapter 24. Reeto is caught. Larry's slow walk was suddenly changed to a quick one as a plan of action was unfolded in his mind. He hurried to the elevated station and was soon on his way downtown to the office of the steamship line to which the turtle belonged. Guess I'd better stop and telephone to Mr. Imberg about Reeto skipping out again, thought the young reporter. He can add it to the story. Then I can tell him of my present plan. The city editor was soon informed of what Larry intended to do and said he thought it was a good idea. "But keep in touch with us, Larry," cautioned Mr. Imberg. "We want all the news we can get on this thing. There's a rumor that the Scorcher is going to spring something today on the Potter story. Probably something Sullivan has given out to offset the story he knows I'll have about him," commented Larry. "But I'll be on the lookout and let you know what happens." Larry was soon at the steamship office and inquired whether the Turtle had docked yet. "She is making fast now," replied the clerk. "May I go aboard her?" The clerk hesitated. Then Larry announced who he was and said he wanted to have a talk with Captain Trella. "Oh, you're the reporter who wrote up the wreck of the Olivia," the clerk replied with a smile. "I've heard about you. Yes, I guess you can go aboard. I'll write you out a pass." With the necessary paper as a passport, Larry walked down the long, covered dock, alongside of which the freight steamer was being warped into place. There was no bustling crowd of passengers, eager to get ashore to welcome and be welcomed by even more eager relatives and friends. But there was a small army of men ready to swarm aboard the Turtle and hurry the freight out of her holds, in order that more might be placed in to be sent abroad. There was a confusion of wagons and trucks, and the puffing of donkey engines, seemingly anxious to begin lifting big boxes and bales from the dark interior of the ship. Larry was among the first to go up the gangplank when it was run ashore. A ship's officer stopped him, but allowed him to proceed when he saw the pass. Larry found Captain Trella in his cabin, arranging his papers, for there is considerable formality about a ship that comes from one country to another, and much red tape is used. "Ah, it is my newspaper friend," exclaimed the commander when he saw Larry. "Have you interviewed any more captains who have been wrecked?" Though he spoke with an air of gaiety, Larry could see the captain was sad at heart. For though it was not his fault that the Olivia had gone ashore, Captain Trella had been more or less blamed and had been reduced in rank. Passengers do not, as a rule, care to sail in a ship under the command of one whose vessel has been lost. So poor Captain Trella was now only in charge of a freighter, and he felt his disgrace keenly. "Do you remember a passenger named reeto who sailed with you on the Olivia?" the reporter asked. "I remember him, yes. A queer sort of man. He said but little on the whole voyage. But was he not lost? I remember we could not find him when we had all been landed from the wreck." "He came ashore first of all," replied Larry. "A fisherman and I helped save him from a life raft, and he told the circumstances." "Queer," murmured the captain. "I have often thought of that man. He seemed to have some mystery about him." Larry gave a brief account of the case he was working on. "What I want to discover," he added, "is whether you know of any reason why reeto should be anxious to see you." "To see me?" "Yes. He was at the steamship office a few days ago, inquiring when your ship would come in, and when he saw me he hurried away. Since then I have not been able to catch him." "Ah, I know," exclaimed the captain suddenly. "I just thought of it. I have a package belonging to him." "A package?" "Yes. He came to me when we were a few days out and said he wanted me to keep a package for him until we got to New York. I took it and put it with my papers. Then I suppose it was lost with the Olivia?" "No. I brought it ashore with me when I saved my documents and a few valuables from the wreck. I have it at my hotel. That is why he is anxious to see me. He wants to get his package back. I am glad I have it." "Do you know anything about the man?" asked Larry. "Hardly anything. I met him for the first time when he was a passenger on my ship. But now, if you have no objections, we will go ashore. I must file my reports. After that I will be glad to see you at my hotel and answer any questions you care to ask." "Well, I guess you've told me all you can," said Larry, feeling a little disappointed at the result of his interview. "I'm much obliged to you. If you want to get into communication with this man, I have a plan," suggested the captain. "What?" asked Larry eagerly. "He will probably call at my hotel to claim his package. When he comes you could be on hand, but there is no telling when he will come." "That is so, but you could take a room at the hotel and be there as much as possible. I think he will come as soon as he learns that my ship is in." "That's a good idea." "I'll do it," exclaimed Larry. "Then let's hurry ashore, and you can make your arrangements while I finish up the details of the indents, bills of lading, custom lists, and so on," Captain Trella said. The two walked down the gangplank onto the covered dock. The tangle of wagons, horses, and men was worse than ever. Part of the cargo was being taken out and carted away. Watch out for yourself that a horse doesn't step on you, cautioned the captain. It was a needful warning, for the animals drawing big, heavy trucks seemed to be everywhere. As the two proceeded to thread their way through the maze, there came a hail from somewhere in the rear, and a voice called, "Captain Trella." The commander turned, and so did Larry. The young reporter saw a man hurrying along the dock toward where the commander of the Turtle stood. Evidently, he had not seen the captain come to a halt, for he called again, "Wait a minute, Captain Trella." Then a curious thing happened. The man caught sight of Larry, standing beside the ship commander. He halted and turned to run. As he did so, a truck drove up behind him and blocked his retreat. "It's Reeto," exclaimed Larry, as he caught sight of the man's face. An instant later, there came a warning shout from the driver of the truck. He reined his horses back sharply, but not in time. Reeto had stepped directly under their heads. The off animal reared. The man stumbled and fell beneath its hoofs. Then, with a cry of terror, which was echoed by a score of men who saw the accident, Reeto appeared to crumple up in a heap. The forefeet of the big steed seemed to crush him before the driver could back the animal off. Then came silence. Reeto lying without moving on the planking of the dock. "Caught at last," murmured Larry, as he rushed forward. Chapter 25. In the hospital. Instantly the confusion that had reigned on the dock became worse. Men ran to and fro shouting, no one seeming to know what to do. "We must help him," cried Captain Trella, shoving his papers into his pocket. "Come." He and Larry fought their way to the man's side. A crowd surrounded him, but no one offered to do anything. The truck driver had dismounted from his high seat and was quieting his frightened horses. "It wasn't my fault," he cried. He ran right under their feet. One side, exclaimed a loud voice, and a burly policeman shouldered his way through. "What's the matter? Give the man some air." Reeto did not look as though he would ever need air again. He seemed quite dead. "Let me get at him," called Captain Trella. "I know something of medicine. Shall I call an ambulance?" asked Larry of the police officer. "I know how to do it." The bluecoat nodded, glad to have help in the emergency. Then he proceeded to keep the crowd back while the captain knelt down beside the unfortunate man. "Bad cut on the head," the commander of the Turtle murmured. "Fractured, I'm afraid. Leg broken, too. It's a wonder he wasn't killed." The captain accepted several coats which were hastily offered and made a pillow for the man's head. He arranged the broken leg so that the bones would be in a better position for setting, and then, with a sponge and a basin of water which were brought, proceeded to wipe away the blood from the cut on Reeto's skull. The crowd increased and pressed closer, but by this time more policemen had arrived, and they kept the throng back from the sufferer so that he might have air. It seemed a long time before the ambulance, which Larry summoned, made its arrival, but it was only a few minutes ere it clanged up to the pier, the crowd parting to let it pass. In an instant, the white-suited surgeon had leaped out of the back of the vehicle before it had stopped and was kneeling beside Reeto. With deft fingers, he felt of the wound on the man's head. "Possible fracture," he said in a low voice. "Double one of the leg, I'm afraid," as he glanced at that member. "Lend a hand, boys, and we'll get him on the stretcher." There were willing enough helpers, and Reeto was soon in the ambulance and on the way to the hospital, the doctor clinging to the back of the swaying vehicle as it dashed through the streets, with the right-of-way over everything on wheels. "Here's news in bunches," thought Larry, as he saw the ambulance disappearing around a corner. "I must telephone this in, and I guess it will be a beat. To think that after all that I have Reeto where I want him. I'm sorry, of course, that he's hurt, but I guess he can't get out of the hospital very soon. I'll have a chance to question him. Then I'll make him tell me where Mr. Potter is, and that will end my special assignment. I'll not be sorry either. It's been a hard one, though I'm glad I got it, for the experience is fine." Thus, musing, Larry looked for a telephone station, and soon the story of Reeto's accident was being sent over the wire to the city editor. "This will make a fine lead for our Potter story," said Larry, as he finished telling of the accident. "I've got another plan," said Mr. Imberg. "What is it? Do you think anyone else knows who Reeto is? I mean, anyone on the pier who saw him hurt?" "I think not. Captain Trella might, but other reporters are not likely to connect him with the case. Then this is what I'm going to do. I'll use the story of the accident separate from the Potter story. We'll say an unidentified man was run down on the pier. If he has a fractured skull, he'll not be able to tell who he is, and he has probably taken good care that there are no papers in his clothes by which his name can be learned. If we state that the injured man is the mysterious reeto, who was mixed up in the Potter case, we'll have every reporter in New York camping out at that hospital waiting for a chance to get the information from him. If we keep quiet, we may be able to get it ourselves without any of the others knowing it. We'll try that way, Larry. It's a risk, but you've got to take risks in this business. The young reporter admired the generalship of his city editor, who could thus plan a magnificent beat. Larry saw the feasibility of the plan. If he kept his information to himself, no one would know, but what the injured man was a stranger in New York, and that he was connected with the Potter case would be farthest from the thoughts of any reporters who were working on the Missing Millionaire story. You must camp on his trail, Larry, Mr. Berg went on. As soon as you hear from the hospital people that he is in shape to talk, get in to see him. You can truthfully claim to be a friend and acquaintance, for you once helped to save his life. If you get a chance to talk to him, ask where Potter is and let us know at once. We'll get out an extra, if need be. Now hurry over to the hospital and let us hear from you as soon as possible. Get a good story and a beat. I only hope I can, murmured Larry, as he left the telephone booth and started for the hospital to which reeto had been taken. He had a slight acquaintance with the superintendent of the institution, and when he explained his errand, the official agreed to let Larry in to see the man as soon as the nurses and surgeons had finished dressing his injuries. How is he? Asked Larry. The superintendent called over a private telephone connected with the ward where reeto had been taken. How is the patient just brought in from the pier? Comfortable? That's good. Then he turned to Larry. I guess you can go up soon, he added. Can you give us his name and some particulars? He was unconscious when he came in, and the superintendent prepared to jot down the information on his record book. This was a complication Larry had not foreseen. If he gave the superintendent the fugitive's name, any other reporters who came to the hospital to inquire about the injured man would at once connect reeto with the Potter mystery, and the leader's chance for a beat would be small indeed. What was he to do? He decided to take the superintendent partly into his confidence. I know the name he goes by, he said as the beginning of his account, but I do not believe it is his right one. I think it is an alias he uses. Never mind then, the superintendent interrupted, much to Larry's relief. If it's a false name, we don't want it. I believe it is, Larry added, and he was honest in that statement, for he felt that reeto was playing some deep game, and, in that case, would not be likely to use his right name. We don't want our records wrong, the head of the hospital resumed. We'll wait until he can tell us about himself. The telephone bell rang at that juncture, and the superintendent answering it told Larry the patient was now in bed and could be seen. Don't get him excited, cautioned the official. I want to get some information from him about himself when you are through. It is sometimes the custom in New York in accident cases to allow reporters to interview the victims when their physical condition admits of it. So it was no new thing for Larry to go into the hospital ward to speak to reeto. He passed through rows of white cots, on which reclined men in all stages of disease and accident. There was a sickish smell of iodoform in the atmosphere, and the sight of the pale faces on either side made Larry sad at heart. There's your patient, said a nurse who was with him, as she led Larry to the bed where reeto reclined under the white coverings that matched the hue of his face. Now don't excite him. You newspaper men don't care what you do as long as you get a story, and sometimes all the work we nurses do goes for nothing. I'll be careful, promised Larry. The nurse, who had other duties to keep her busy, left Larry at the bedside of the mysterious man. He was lying with his eyes shut as Larry approached. Mr. Reeto, called the reporter. There was no response. Mr. Reeto, spoke Larry a little louder. At that the man opened his eyes. Were you calling me? He asked. Then he caught sight of Larry, and a smile came on his face. Well, you found me, I see, was his greeting. Only for that, team, I'd been far away. I suppose so. But now you're here, for which I'm sorry. I hope you will answer me a few questions. What are they? Asked the man, and a spasm of pain replaced his smile. I believe you know the secret of Mr. Potter's disappearance, said Larry, speaking in a low tone so none of the other patients would hear him. I want you to tell me where he is. At the mention of Mr. Potter's name, Reeto raised himself in bed. His face that had been pale became flushed. He is... Then he stopped. He seemed unable to speak. Yes, yes, exclaimed Larry, eagerly. "Where is he?" "He is—" Then Reto fell back on the bed. "He has fainted," cried the nurse, running to the cot. The strain has been too much for him, and she pressed an electric button which summoned the doctor. Chapter 26. A New Clue. Larry moved to one side. The unexpected outcome of his interview had startled him. He did not quite know what to do. The doctor came up on the run and made a hasty examination of the patient. Then he sent for another surgeon. Larry heard them talking. "What is it?" he asked of his friend the nurse. "His skull is fractured," she said in a low voice. They did not think so at first, but now the symptoms show it. They're going to operate at once. It is the only chance of saving his life. There goes my story, thought Larry, regretfully. It was not that he was hard-hearted or indifferent to Reto's sufferings. Simply that his newspaper instinct got ahead of everything else, as it does in all true reporters, who, if they have a nose for news, will make copy out of even their closest friend, though they may dislike the operation very much. "You had better go," the nurse advised Larry. "You will not be able to see him again for some time. No one will be allowed to talk to him until he is on the road to recovery. If we can save him. He has a bad fracture." Much disappointed, Larry left the hospital. It was hard to be almost on the verge of getting the story and then to see his chance slip away. "I'm sure he was just going to tell me where Mr. Potter is," thought the reporter. "Now it means a long wait, if I ever find out at all from him." He told Mr. Imberg what had happened. The city editor decided to follow out his first plan of not connecting the accident at the pier with the Potter mystery. "If he has to be operated on for a fractured skull," Mr. Imberg remarked to Larry over the wire, "he will be in no condition to tell his name or give any information for some time. The story is safe with him. Now you'd better get busy on some other line of the case. The Scorcher is out, but they only have a scare yarn, without any foundation, to the effect that Mr. Potter is still in Italy, and that his family knows where he is." "That's all bosh," exclaimed Larry. "That's what I think," the city editor said. "Now get on the job, Larry, and arrange to give us a good story for tomorrow. Keep watch of Reto, and as soon as the doctors will let you see him, try again, though of course it may not be for several days." Larry was all at sea. He hung up the telephone receiver with a vague feeling that being a reporter on a special assignment was not all it was cracked up to be. "Easy enough to say get a good story for tomorrow," he remarked to himself, "but I'd like to know how I'm going to do it. The story, the only story there is safe with Reto, and he can't tell it. What shall I do?" Larry asked himself. "Let me think. I guess I'd better go see Captain Trella and ask him to keep mum about Reto until I have another chance at the man. Then I'll go and tell Grace. She'll want to know all about it." He found Captain Trella at his hotel, having finished all the details connected with the docking of the Turtle. The commander readily agreed to keep quiet concerning Reto's identity, since the captain had no desire for further newspaper notoriety. "I will do more than this," he declared. "I will give you the package belonging to that queer man. I have to sail again soon on a long voyage, and he might need it before I come back. You can give it to him if he recovers. If it is not, well, the authorities can open it. It may contain money or something that will tell about the poor fellow. I leave it with you." Larry was glad to get possession of the package that seemed of such importance to Reto. He wished he could open it, as he thought he might get a clue to the connection between the millionaire and the mysterious man, but he knew he would have no right to do that. Also, it would give him a sort of claim on Reto, and by returning the package, he could have a good excuse for going to see him. "Now to tell Grace," remarked Larry, as he left Captain Trella. "I'm sure she'll be anxious to hear the news." The millionaire's daughter was indeed glad to see Larry. She had read the first edition of the Leader, and wanted to know if there was anything further to tell. "I hope to be able to give you some definite news," replied Larry, in answer to her questions. Then he related the scene in the hospital. "Poor man," exclaimed Grace. "I wish I could go and see him." "I'm afraid they wouldn't let you," said the reporter. "I called up the place just before I came here, and they said the man was still under the influence of ether, though the operation was over." "Was it a success?" "They think so, but it will be some time before he will be able to talk to anyone about your father. We shall have to be patient." "It is so hard," complained Grace, and Larry agreed with her. He did not yet see how he was going to get a story for the next day's paper. That is, a story which would have some fresh features in it. "I don't suppose you have anything new to tell me," he asked of Grace. Not much. I have had another letter from my father. It came a little while ago. Is it the same as the others? The contents are, but the envelope is different. He says he will soon be home and tells us not to worry. She gave the missive to Larry. He looked at the postmark and saw that it had come from a downtown substation. This was mailed near the steamer pier, he exclaimed, close to where Reeto was hurt. He must have posted it just previous to the accident. I wish I had known this before. It was too late now, and Larry gazed regretfully at the envelope. Clearly, Reeto had not been far from Mr. Potter at the time of the accident. Perhaps the missing millionaire was hiding downtown in New York. I must make some inquiries in that neighborhood, thought Larry, as he arose to go. Another thing, Grace said. That man Sullivan was in front of the house again this morning. I must see him, exclaimed Larry. I'll make him tell what his object is. This thing has got to end. He was fiercely determined that he would force some information from the politician. Evidently, Sullivan had a game on hand, which the reporter had not yet succeeded in fathoming. I'll hunt him up at once, he added, as he bade Grace goodbye. Be careful, she cautioned. He is a dangerous man. I will, Larry promised. But he could not find Sullivan. For once, that wily politician denied himself to reporters and kept out of their way. He was sought by a number of newspaper men, for the matter of a candidate for the 8th Assembly District was again to the fore, and the henchmen of Kilburn and Riley were making rival claims as to Sullivan's support. Where is Sullivan? Was the cry that went up, and in the next 2 days that became almost as much of a mystery as the disappearance of Mr. Potter. Get busy, Larry, advised Mr. Imberg, and Larry did his best to follow the advice. 3 weeks passed, and Sullivan was not found. His family professed not to know where he was, and the best newspaper men in New York could not find him. Larry was working on the case with all the energy he had thrown into the Potter disappearance. Meanwhile, the young reporter kept a close watch on the hospital where Reeto was. The operation had been a success, but the patient was in a fever, during which he was out of his mind. He could not recognize anyone, much less talk intelligibly. Larry made several calls at the institution, but it was of no use. You can't see him, said the nurse, when he had paid his usual visit one day. But he is much better. I think by the day after tomorrow you can talk to him. His fever is going down, and he has spells when he talks rationally. There was another man in to see him today. I thought you said no one could visit him. Well, we made an exception in this case. The man was a private detective searching for a missing man, and he wanted to see all the patients. He looked at your friend last, and went off, seemingly quite excited. What missing man was he looking for? Asked Larry. A Mr. Potter. Seems to me I've read something about him in the papers. He's very rich. Mr. Potter, exclaimed Larry. The detective must be from the private agency, he added to himself. Then aloud, did he recognize Mr. Rhett? I mean the man with the fractured skull? And he waited anxiously for the nurse's answer. He seemed to, but I was called away just then. I know how Mr. Potter looks, Larry went on. He has a mustache, and the man here is smooth-shaven. No, the patient has a mustache and a beard now, the nurse replied with a smile. They grew since he has been in the hospital. A sudden idea came to Larry, an idea so strange that it startled him. He dared not speak of it. He believed the detective held the same theory. I'll call again, he said, thanking the nurse for the information she had given him. I must see Grace at once, he murmured as he left the hospital. Strange I never thought of that. A beard and a mustache. The private detective. I wonder if he recognized Reeto? I must hurry. Oh, if this should prove true. He hurried to an elevated station and was soon on his way to Grace's house. Chapter 27. The Detective's Theory. Bounding up the steps 3 at a time, Larry rang the bell of the Potter residence. He thought the door would never be opened, and when the stately butler did swing back the portal, the young reporter, not waiting to ask for anyone, stepped into the hall. No one at home, the servant remarked with a smile, for he had gotten to be on quite friendly terms with Larry. No one home? No. Mrs. Potter and Miss Grace have gone to Lakewood, New Jersey, for a few days. Mrs. Potter was quite ill, and the doctor advised a change of air, so she suddenly decided to go. When are they coming back? I can't rightly say. In a few days, I expect. I was told to tell you that if anything important occurred, you could write to them. Here is the address. And the butler gave Larry a slip of paper. I wonder whether I ought to telegraph, thought Larry to himself. I think this is very important, yet I am not sure enough of it myself. I can't see reeto until the day after tomorrow. I had better wait until then. If my suspicions are confirmed, I will send a message, in case they are not back by that time. Larry was about to leave the house when he saw a man coming up the front steps. He recognized him as a member of the private detective agency which he and Grace had visited. "Is Mrs. Potter home?" asked the man of the butler, who was standing in the open front door, while Larry remained in the shadow of the hall. "No, she has gone to Lakewood." "Lakewood? That's too bad," exclaimed the man. "Is it anything important?" inquired the butler. "I think I have located Mr. Potter," was the answer. "I am a private detective, hired by Miss Grace Potter. I came to see if she or her mother would accompany me to try to identify a man I believe is the missing millionaire." "Where is he?" asked the butler. "In a hospital, quite badly hurt." "Mr. Potter in a hospital? Badly hurt?" cried the servant in alarm. "What shall I do? Can't they bring him home?" "We must be sure it is him," the detective went on. "The description answers pretty well, but it would take a member of the family to make sure. So there's no one home? Eh? Well, that's too bad. I wanted to test my theory that the hospital patient is the missing millionaire." "You can telegraph to them," suggested the butler. "I have the address." "That's what I'll do," the detective replied. "I'll tell them what I have discovered. They can get here tomorrow, and we'll see if he's the right man." The officer took the address the servant gave him and hurried away. "Did you hear that?" cried the butler to Larry. "Mr. Potter is found." "I hope it proves true," the reporter replied. "That is just what I came about, but when I found Mrs. Potter gone, I didn't know what to do. I had rather the detective would take the responsibility of telegraphing. Perhaps the man in the hospital is not Mr. Potter." "Do you know him?" asked the butler. "I have met him several times," replied Larry, "but I did not know he was Mr. Potter. It just dawned on me that he might be." "Well, well, how strange it all is," murmured the butler. "Who would have thought it? Well, we can't do anything until tomorrow." "No, I guess not," answered Larry, as he went down the steps. His mind was in a tumult. More and more he was coming to believe that the mysterious man in the hospital was the missing millionaire. "That's what he meant when he said I was following him too close," mused Larry. "And I never suspected it. How glad Grace will be. What a story I shall have. I wish I had discovered him myself, without any help from the detective agency. But it will make good reading, anyhow. I must arrange it so we can get a scoop out of it." His first act was to go to the office of the paper and tell Mr. Imberg what had occurred. The city editor was much excited by the news. "That will make a great yarn," he exclaimed. "I hope your friend Grace soon comes back with her mother and makes the identification complete. We must do nothing to hasten matters, or some other paper will get onto the game and spoil our story." "Even the hospital people don't suspect yet," said Larry. "They don't know who their patient is. Not even his assumed name. I guess things are coming our way. We'll clear up the Potter mystery and the Sullivan disappearance at the same time. I believe Sullivan is in with Mr. Potter on some deal. It begins to look suspicious. The friends of Riley and Kilburn are all at sea. They'd give $1,000 to know which way Sullivan was going to jump." Larry paid an early visit to the hospital the next day to see how matters were progressing. His friend, the nurse, greeted him with a smile. "I guess you can have an interview with your mysterious acquaintance now," she said. "He is much better than we expected and, for the first time since the operation, talks rationally. We have not questioned him yet. We are not as curious as you newspapermen are." "Well, we have to be," responded Larry. "Can I go up now? Has the man who was here yesterday been back?" "Yes to your first question, and no to the second. You can go up." The superintendent left word to that effect. "He is quite friendly to you." Larry started for the ward where reeto was. His heart was beating strangely. He felt that he was on the verge of solving the secret of the millionaire's disappearance and restoring to Grace her father. As he approached the bed where reeto reclined, he was motioned back by another nurse on duty there. "He has just fallen asleep," she said. "When he awakens again, you may speak to him. He has been writing a letter." Larry was disappointed. He looked at the man who had played such an important part in the disappearance of the millionaire, and who, he believed, was destined to assume a much more important role. The patient's beard and mustache had grown since the accident, and the smooth-shaven man was no more. Instead, Larry saw before him a person who, as he recalled the photographs of Mr. Potter, bore a remarkable resemblance to the millionaire. Of course, Mr. Potter had only a mustache and no beard, but aside from that, Larry was positive that, lying on the bed in front of him, was Grace's father. Chapter 28. A terrible mistake. How Larry wished the patient would awaken, so he could question him, but the invalid showed no signs of it, and was in a deep slumber. "That will do him more good than medicine," said the nurse. "He will probably sleep for several hours." "Several hours," repeated Larry in dismay. "Yes, they often do." "Then there is no use in me waiting," he said. "I'll come back again. When I do, I may bring his daughter with me." "I hope you do," the nurse replied. "I have felt so sorry for the poor man. He seemed to have no friends ever since he has been here." "Who is he?" "I don't want to say for sure, until I get his daughter to identify him," Larry said, for he did not want the story to get out before the leader had a chance to print it. He decided he would go to the Potter house and see if Grace had returned yet in response to the telegram sent by the detective. He felt sure she would start immediately on receipt of the message. In this he was correct, for when he got to the millionaire's home, Grace herself answered his ring. "Oh, Larry, tell me quick," she exclaimed. "Where is he? Is he badly hurt? What is the matter? Do you think it is really he?" "I hope so," Larry said. "Where is your mother?" "She stayed in Lakewood. I didn't tell her anything about it, for fear it would prove a disappointment. The telegram from the detective came to me, and I made up my mind to come home alone and clear matters up before I told Mother. She needs a rest, as she is very nervous. But now I am here. You must take me to the hospital at once." The telegram said he was in a hospital. "How did it happen? Is he badly hurt?" "I think he is almost well. But how did they discover him? Who did it? How did it come about?" "It will take some time to answer all the questions," replied Larry with a smile. "I'll tell you all I can on the way to the hospital. My mysterious friend, reeto, it seems, has turned out to be your father. Then he was the one I saw in front of the house that night, and I thought it was father," said Grace. "His smooth-shaven face deceived me, but I was sure I could not mistake his figure. There have been a good many surprises in this case," Larry admitted. "I've often been fooled myself." "Let's hurry to the hospital," suggested Grace. "I'd rather go with you than with that detective. He is to be here at 11 o'clock, and it's only 10 now. Let's hurry away." Larry agreed, and they left the house. Grace explained that she had caught the first express out of Lakewood that morning and had been home only half an hour when Larry called. They were so busy talking over all the details of the queer case that they arrived at the hospital much quicker than they anticipated. "Here we are," said Larry, as he led the way up the broad stone steps of the institution. "I'm almost afraid to go in," remarked Grace, her voice showing a nervous dread. "It seems so strange. I'm quite frightened, Larry." "Don't think of anything but that you're going to see your father," the reporter replied, reassuringly. "He'll be so glad to see you. I believe he would have been home long before this if it had not been for the accident." Larry entered the office of the institution. No sooner had he stepped inside than he was made aware that something unusual had occurred. Nurses and doctors, with anxious looks, were hastening here and there. Orderlies and messengers were hurrying to and fro, and there was a continuous ringing of signal and telephone bells. "Must have been an accident and a lot of patients bought in," said Larry, for he had seen such activity in hospitals before when a number of injured persons required treatment at once. "Oh, how terrible!" exclaimed Grace. "Do you suppose many are killed?" "I hope not, but it looks as if something very unusual had happened." Just then Larry saw the nurse who had been at the bedside of the patient whom he and Grace had come to see. "I've brought his daughter," he said to the uniformed attendant. "May we go up now?" The nurse seemed confused. "I don't know. I'll see," she remarked. "Here is the superintendent. Perhaps you had better speak to him." And she whispered something to the official. "There's something wrong about Mr. Potter," was Larry's first thought. "I wonder if he could have suddenly died." Even Grace, unaccustomed as she was to hospital scenes, was aware that all was not as it should be. "Oh, Larry," she exclaimed. "What is the matter? Have they taken him away?" "I don't know," the reporter answered in a low tone. "I'll soon find out." The superintendent approached them. You wanted to see that patient who was brought in from the steamship pier? He inquired. We've never been able to obtain his name. I can tell you what it is, answered Larry. We have every reason to believe he is Hamden Potter, the missing millionaire, and this young lady's father. May we see him? Hamden Potter, exclaimed the superintendent. That's who he is, declared Larry. He went by the name Reeto while he was away. May we go up now? I am sorry, said the superintendent slowly, but that patient escaped from the ward about half an hour ago, and we have not been able to trace him. Escaped, cried Larry. My father gone again, gasped Grace. Too bad, but that's what has happened, the superintendent repeated. The nurse left him sleeping quietly and went downstairs to get some medicine. When she came back, he was gone. But how could he go out without any clothing? Asked Larry. He got some clothing, the head of the institution replied. In the bed next to him was a patient who was to be discharged as cured today. That man's clothes were brought to him and laid out on a chair beside the bed. While he was in the bathroom, Mr. Potter, as you call him, got possession of the clothes, put them on, and walked out. Several patients saw him go, but said nothing, as they thought it was all right. When the nurse got back, she missed your friend and gave the alarm. Can't you tell in what direction he went? Asked Larry. So far we have been unsuccessful. We have made inquiries outside, but so many persons are passing in the street that it has been impossible to trace him. Was he able to walk very far? The reporter asked. He was strong, much stronger than the usual run of patients who are recovering from such a wound as he had. He must have been more fully recovered than we thought. He had written a letter, the nurse tells me, and this is also gone. Probably he was temporarily out of his mind and went out to mail the missive. It is a strange occurrence. My poor father, exclaimed Grace. I thought I had found him, and now he is missing again. Larry did not know what to do. It was a curious state of affairs. He had been so sure of uniting Mr. Potter and Grace, but now all his plans had come to nothing. Then, too, there was the paper to be considered. Mr. Berg would expect him to send in the story of the mysterious disappearance of the hospital patient. Yet Larry did not like to leave Grace while he went to telephone. He was in a curious predicament. We will send out a general alarm if we do not find him soon, the superintendent went on. Occasionally, delirious patients wander from the wards while the nurses are temporarily absent, but they are always found hiding in some part of the hospital. We have not yet completed the search. Only once in a great while do they get outside the institution. Yet Mr. Potter may have. Then we may never find him again, spoke Grace. Don't worry, Larry advised, as cheerfully as he could. He'll come back. I'll never see him again. And Grace was on the verge of tears. Oh, this is terrible. Just then there was heard a confusion of sounds in the corridor outside of the superintendent's office. The latter went to the door, and through the open portal Grace and Larry heard someone exclaim, He's come back. Maybe that's him, cried the reporter. The superintendent returned to his office. I have a pleasant surprise for you, he exclaimed. The patient has come back. He says he went out to a telephone. Is he all right? Asked Grace. Better than ever. The little trip seemed to do him good. Here he is. He threw open the door he had closed. There, standing in the corridor, was the man Larry had known as Reeto, the man he believed was Mr. Potter. The patient was smiling at the reporter. There is your father, Grace, said Larry. The girl gave one look at the man confronting her. She seemed to sway forward and became deathly pale. That is not my father, she cried as she fell in a faint. Chapter 29. In his enemy's power. Quick, catch her, cried the hospital superintendent, springing forward, but it was Larry who put out his arms and kept Grace from falling to the floor. Here, nurse, called one of several physicians who had gathered in the corridor when the news spread that the missing patient had returned. Look after her, please. Carry her into the receiving room. Who is she? Asked the patient, who had caused such a stir, and to whom no one seemed to be paying any attention in the excitement caused by Grace's swoon. The man had not caught a good look at the girl. She is Grace Potter, replied Larry, glancing curiously at Reeto. Grace Potter? Hamden Potter's daughter. The man seemed greatly excited. Yes, she came here expecting, as I did, to meet her father. I thought you were Mr. Potter. She says you are not. No, I am not, replied the man. Then who are you? Where is her father? You know, I am sure of it. Larry was upset over the mistake he and the detective had made. I didn't know where Mr. Potter was, and as he made that answer, Reeto gave every evidence of being under a great strain. His hands shook with more than the weakness of his illness. He was paler than the white hue caused by his confinement in the hospital. Why? Have you lost track of him? I am afraid so. Listen, young man, perhaps you can help me. Let us get to some place where we can talk. I have strange news for you. Then you know me? And the young reporter looked somewhat surprised. I couldn't very well help it, with the way you have kept after me lately. But we have no time to lose. Something most unexpected has happened. Mr. Potter is in the hands of his enemies. Then he is found? Yes, in a way, but he might better be lost. What do you mean? Come in here, and I will tell you. Reeto led the way to a small room off the main corridor. What does this mean? Asked the hospital superintendent. I will explain later, replied Reeto. Just now, it is very necessary that I have a talk with this young man. The superintendent turned away and Reeto closed the door. He sat down in a chair, and Larry could see that he was trembling from weakness. I must talk quickly, he said, for I am still very ill. I made a desperate effort to go out in order to get in communication with Mr. Potter. I mailed him a letter and then called him up on the telephone. Then you know where he was, burst out Larry. I did, but I do not now. Listen, and don't ask too many questions yet. All will soon be explained, if it is not too late. I am Mr. Potter's friend. He took me into his confidence when he found it necessary, for very strong reasons, to disappear. I agreed to help him and do exactly as he wanted me to. He has been hiding across the Hudson River, outside of the legal jurisdiction of New York State. I was in touch with him by telephone and otherwise up to the time of my accident on the pier. Since then, of course, I have not been able to hold any communication with him. As soon as I had the chance, which came for the first time today, I got out and called him on the telephone. I was told by the man, with whom he had been staying, that about an hour ago, some men came and took him away. Some men took him away? Yes. Men whom I recognized by the description as his enemies, as men who have an interest in getting Mr. Potter into their power. He has been trying all this while to keep out of their way. Now they have him. But what's to be done? Asked the young reporter. I don't know, replied Reeto, hopelessly. Everything was going on all right until those horses knocked me down. Larry was conscious of a strange sensation. It was partly due to his impetuosity. He felt that Reeto had been injured. Larry partly blamed himself for Mr. Potter's present plight, since through the reporter's instrumentality, the millionaire's friend had not been able to keep in touch with him. I'll find him, exclaimed Larry. Tell me what to do. I'll trace him. If I was only stronger, said Reeto. I'm so weak that I couldn't walk another block. I'd like to get after those scoundrels who have Mr. Potter. I'll get after them, cried the youthful newspaper man, thinking more of Grace just then than he did of his assignment. Tell me where to go. I can only tell you where Mr. Potter was hiding, went on Reeto. That was in a little house just outside of Jersey City. The men must have gone there after him. Possibly you can trace them from the house. Tell me how to get to the place. Reeto gave the necessary instructions. I'm going over there, exclaimed the young reporter. What are you going to do with Grace? That's so. I forgot about her. I'll take her along. And Larry sprang to his feet in his enthusiasm and started for the door. Can she stand the trip? She's a brave girl. She'll be glad to go. Then you'd better hurry. Every minute is precious. Great things hang on this. If Mr. Potter's enemies force him to do certain things which he has been trying to avoid doing, the consequences will be very bad for many persons. Hurry, Dexter. I'll start at once. I wonder if Grace is better. The young reporter and Reeto left the small room. Larry soon found that Grace had recovered from her swoon. Rapidly, he told her of what he proposed doing. With her, he would go to Jersey City and try to trace the missing millionaire. And we'll find him, he added with vigor. He went downstairs to telephone to Mr. M. Berg of the new and unexpected turn the case had taken. Keep right after it, Larry, said the city editor. Find Mr. Potter and get the story. As the leader reporter turned to go upstairs, he saw, entering the hospital, a young man whom he recognized as Hans Fritsch, the German newspaper man he had met at the lonely tenement. What are you doing here? Asked Larry, noting that his friend was attired in an automobile suit. I comes to see how gets along a friend of mine. He is here sick. I have a day off from mine work, and I comes in my new automobile. After that, I goes me for a nice ride. Come along. Where are you going? Asked Larry, a sudden idea coming into his head. Ophir by New Jersey. Dear is goot, automobiling roads. Are you going to Jersey City? Sure. I goes by dot onder ferry. Then I skips out by der plank road. Und maybe I goes me out to der Oranges Mountains. I'm just learning to run my car good. I'll go with you, cried Larry. Have you room in your car for two? Surely. 4 if you likes to bring him. My mother, who is in Germany, und quite well off, sent me der car for a birthday present. Otherwise, I should not have him. Reporters here do not get moneys enough to buy automobiles. I'll be with you in 5 minutes, exclaimed Larry, hurrying off to tell Grace. I am ready as soon as I see how my sick friend is, declared the German reporter. Then we go quick like the wind. You and he have a good time? Yes, and maybe a hot pursuit, said Larry under his breath, for he had determined on a bold plan. He would, in Fritsch's auto, give chase to the captors of Mr. Potter. Chapter 30. Mr. Potter is found. Conclusion. There was a throbbing of the motor, a grinding and shrieking as the clutch was thrown in, a trembling to the car as Fritsch advanced the spark and opened the gasoline throttle still wider, and the automobile, bearing the German reporter, Larry and Grace, was off. Here are some goggles, said Fritsch, handing back 2 pairs to his passengers. You will need them when V goes like the wind. If I had known I was to half a lady, I would get a dust coat. It doesn't matter, replied Grace, her eyes shining with the excitement. I want to find my father. Your father? Then Larry explained. He could safely do so, since the German paper did not come out until the morning of the next day, and Fritsch could not beat him. Faster speeded the auto. They went over the Hudson River on a ferry boat, and as soon as Jersey City was reached, the car was sent along as fast as the law allowed. I wonder if I can get on their trail, thought Larry, as he watched the houses skim by and held himself in his seat beside Grace to avoid the jouncing and swaying caused by the uneven streets. Do you think we will have a race? Asked the German, as they neared the house where Mr. Potter had been hiding. Maybe. I hope so. Anyhow, I don't. Why? Don't you want to help find Mr. Potter? Yes, but I am of nervousness yet in my new car. I have never raced. You and I might do some damage. Let me run her, suggested Larry. I've had some experience with autos, and I guess I can manage yours. I ran one like this several times when I was out with Mr. and Berg. Didn't take der veal, went on Fritsch. I comes back with Miss Potter you can race. Oh, Larry, can you do it? And Grace looked a little alarmed. Of course I can, and the young reporter spoke confidently. The car was stopped, and the change made. Larry soon found he could manage the various levers all right, and that the car responded readily to his guiding hand. This must be the place, he said, after they had ridden for half an hour at as high speed as they dared, considering the fact that there were policemen on every other block. He stopped the car in front of a house that seemed to be uninhabited. It answered the description Reeto had given, and Larry knocked on the door. After several minutes, the portal opened a crack, showing that it was held by a chain. Is Mr. Potter here? Asked Larry, though he knew the missing millionaire was not. The man who had opened the door looked suspiciously at the inquirer. It's all right, the young reporter went on. I come from Mr. Reeto. I want to aid Mr. Potter. You're too late, was the answer. They've got him into their clutches. They'll work their game before he knows that everything is all right, and that it is safe for him to show himself. If they had only waited half an hour, all would have been well. I just got another telephone message from Reeto, saying that all matters were satisfactorily adjusted, and that there was no further need for Mr. Potter to hide. But he doesn't know this. I have no way of telling him, and he'll sign the papers before those men will let him go. Tell me in which direction they went, and I'll go after them, cried Larry. They can't have gone far, and we can overtake them in the autos. They have a car too, replied the man. A fast one. They managed, by a trick, to get Mr. Potter into it. If I could only get word to him, he could laugh at their efforts. If I could only send him a message. What is the message? Asked Larry. It is this. The money is safe. Is that all? That's all. But how can you get it to him? Didn't you hear anything that might give you a clue to where the men were going? Somewhere out toward the Orange Mountains. That's all I know. They're going to the home of some lawyer or judge, I believe. There is some legal matter involved. Then that's where we'll go, decided the young reporter, as he hurried back to the auto and told Grace and Fritch what he had heard. "Onto the mountains," cried the German reporter. "My car is yours. It will climb the biggest hills under high gear. You and EV will catch the scoundrels." Once more they were off. They took the plank road to Newark, and on inquiring in the latter city, learned that a car, answering the description of the one Mr. Potter had been taken off in, had passed about half an hour before. "That's not so bad," exclaimed Larry. "We can catch him, I guess." "I hope so," murmured Grace. "If my car doesn't beat the odor one, I gives up riding," remarked Fritch, with proper pride in his machine. They passed through Newark and were soon on the road leading to Orange at the foot of the mountains. The highway was conducive to speed, and Larry let her out several notches, as he expressed it, at the same time keeping watch for policemen on motorcycles, who were alert to nab the unwary auto speeders. Every time they saw a car in front of them, they were anxious until they saw it was not the one they wanted. They passed a number of machines, and when Orange was reached, they had not been successful. "Now for a mountain climb," exclaimed Larry, as he slowed down the engine to give the water a chance to cool off before attempting the ascent. "Will it do Eagle Rock Hill, Fritch?" "I think so," replied the German. "I never tried it, but the circular says it will do it." Eagle Rock Hill is known far and wide as one of the steepest ascents up which an automobile can be sent. Many cars have to take it on the low gear or go as slowly as possible. Even then, it is a strain. "Suppose we should overtake them there," suggested Grace. "We'd catch him," exclaimed the German, with a confidence born of admiration for his car. On and on they chugged. At the foot of the long, steep slope, Larry set the levers on second gear, as he did not want to take any chances with the auto. Up and up they went, their eyes strained through the dust for the sight of a green car, for that was the color of the machine in which rode the man who had taken Mr. Potter away. "Hark!" exclaimed Grace, suddenly. "It sounds like an auto, just ahead of us." "It is," declared Larry, whose quick ear had caught the chug-chug of a motor. An instant later, they had rounded a turn. There in front of them, climbing the steep hill, was a green car, and it could be seen 4 men. "That's them," cried Larry. "Open her up. Throw in the high gear," yelled Fritch, who was now as enthusiastic and as interested in the chase as were either of his companions. "Let her rip." "Will she stand it?" asked Larry, shouting the words over his shoulder to Grace and Fritch in the tonneau. "Sure." There was a grinding noise as Larry threw in the high-speed gear. The auto hung back for an instant because of the sudden change. The motor seemed to groan at the unexpected load thrown on it. Then, like a gallant horse responding to the call of its rider, the car leaped ahead. "Hurrah!" cried Larry. "She'll do it. We'll catch him." The distance between the two cars was lessening. Those in the green machine seemed unaware of the approach of their pursuers. "Can you see your father?" asked the German of Grace. "I'm not sure. It looks like him." She stood up in the tonneau, holding to the back of the seat in front of her to steady herself against the swaying of the car. Just then Larry blew a blast on the horn. As the deep tone responded to his pressure on the big rubber bulb, the men in the green machine looked back. At the sight of one of the faces, Grace cried, "It's father! It's father!" Above the noise made by the two autos, the millionaire heard his daughter's voice. He stood up and, leaning over the back of the seat, waved his hand to her. Then one of the men sitting beside him forcibly drew the millionaire down. "Oh, we must get to him," cried Grace. "They may do him some harm." "Hurry, Larry. Shove her over a few more notches," cried Fritch. "She'll take more gasoline." Larry obeyed the instructions of the German reporter. The car seemed to feel new life and leaped ahead. The distance from the other car was steadily growing less. Fritch's confidence in his machine was not misplaced. But the men in the green car were making efforts to escape. The chauffeur had advanced his spark, and the car was taking the steep grade almost as well as was that of the pursuers. "Can't we catch them?" cried Grace, in an agony of doubt and fear. Larry narrowly watched the green car. He saw that in spite of the efforts of the driver, it was losing speed. "We'll do it," he said quietly. Then Larry tried a trick which had come into his mind almost at the last moment. Keeping his car going as fast as possible, he steered it so as to pass the other auto. He knew he had speed enough to do it, and realized that he must act quickly, as they were almost at the summit of the hill. Closer and closer the two cars came together. that driven by the young reporter gaining. Now the front wheels overlapped the rear ones of the green machine. Now they were at the side door of the tonneau. Now the two tonneaus were even. This was what Larry wanted, slowing down his engine the least bit, so as to keep in pace with the other machine and not pass it. He called across to Mr. Potter as the two autos raced side by side. "Mr. Potter, I bring you a message from your friends." "What is it?" "It is this. The money is safe." "Good," cried the millionaire. "Now I don't care what these scoundrels do." "Father, father," cried Grace. "Stop that machine," yelled Larry to the chauffeur of the green car. "You can't make me," retorted the man. "Jump into our car," cried Fritch to Mr. Potter. "You can do it." The two machines were close together, and so evenly were they running that they seemed to be standing still side by side. The millionaire arose and endeavored to get out of the tonneau and into that of the auto in which sat his daughter. "No, you don't," exclaimed one of the men beside him, and he took hold of Mr. Potter. "Let me go," called the rich man. "I'm not afraid of you now. There's no longer any reason for me to remain in hiding." "You can't go until you sign those papers," cried another of the men. "Stop that car," shouted Larry again. "Let's see you make me," was the impudent retort of the man at the wheel. "I'll make you," declared the young reporter. He gave a quick motion to the steering wheel. Then he shoved the levers over and pressed down the pedal that cut out the muffler and slightly relieved the strain on the motor. Fritch's car shot ahead. Larry steered it directly in front of the green machine and kept just far enough in advance to avoid a collision. "Get out of the way," shouted the driver of the emerald car. "Now I guess you'll stop," retorted the young reporter. The road suddenly narrowed. Larry gradually slowed up his car. There was no room to pass, and the other machine had to slacken up also. Larry suddenly shut off his power and put on the brakes. His machine came to a gradual stop. There was a bump behind, and the other had collided with it, but not enough to cause any damage. "There, I guess you'll stop now," exclaimed Larry, as he leaped from his seat and hurried back to the green car. But the men did not await his coming. With a shout to his companions, the chauffeur of the rear auto leaped out. The others followed his example, leaving Mr. Potter alone in the automobile. "Father, father," cried Grace. "Is this really you, Mr. Potter?" asked the reporter, hardly able to believe that he had found the missing millionaire. "That's who I am," exclaimed the man whom Larry had sought so long. Mr. Potter entered the other machine and clasped Grace into his arms. "I'm back from my enforced exile," he went on. "Now you can send the story to your paper." "I must get to a telephone," cried Larry, his newspaper instincts to the fore again, now that he had successfully covered his special assignment. "Get back into my car," suggested Fritch. "There is a telephone at the top of der hill. I'll drive you now, so long as the race is over." "And we won," cried Grace. "Oh, father, how glad I am to have you back." "How glad I am to get back," replied Mr. Potter. Larry sat beside the German reporter, who took his place at the steering wheel. The other car was left where the men had abandoned it. They had disappeared into the woods on either side of the road and never troubled Mr. Potter again. "Why did you disappear, Mr. Potter?" asked Larry, who had to have some facts to telephone in, as it was near first edition time. "It's a long story to tell, young man," replied the millionaire, "and quite complicated. Briefly, I had to disappear in order to save a number of widows and orphans from losing what little money they depended on for a living. As you have probably guessed, I am interested in many financial matters. One was the building of an extension of the subway. Hundreds of widows and guardians of orphans had bought stock in this enterprise, as it was sold by popular subscription. While abroad, I learned there was a scheme on foot to involve me in certain legal difficulties, and it might even cause my arrest in order to get me to do certain things that would force the price of the subway stock down, and so bankrupt many innocent persons. To prevent this, I determined to disappear, without even the knowledge of my family. How I managed it, I will tell you later. Matters were going along all right until Reeto, whose real name, you might as well know, is Simonson, suddenly disappeared. I did not know what to do, nor how matters, with which I had entrusted him, were progressing. But it wasn't his fault. I wonder what happened to him. Larry explained about Mr. Simonson's accident, of which Mr. Potter was ignorant. When these men, my enemies, unexpectedly appeared today at the house where I had been hiding ever since I disappeared, asked me to appear in a New Jersey court. I had to go with them," went on Mr. Potter. "It was in the nature of an arrest, and I did not dare disobey. They wanted to take me before a Supreme Court justice in his home on the mountain and make me sign certain papers. But you came along in the nick of time. When you gave me that message to the effect that the money was all right, I knew that the affairs of the subway had been so arranged that the stock would not go down and the widows and orphans would not suffer. I was willing then to appear in court, as the schemes of the scoundrels, who had practically kidnapped me, could amount to nothing. But it seems they didn't wait to see what the outcome would be. I'm much obliged to you, Larry." "So am I," added Grace with a smile. "I'd do it all over again for the sake of getting such a good story, and of course finding you and helping your daughter," Larry finished. Now to telephone this in. Mr. Imberg could hardly believe the news that Larry fairly shouted over the wire. "Found him, you say? Good for you, Larry. It'll be a great beat. Wait a minute. I'll let Harvey take the story. Talk fast. Give us enough for the first edition, and then for the second, get the whole story from Mr. Potter." This is a corker. What a scene there was in the Leader office then. Mr. Newton grabbed up paper and pencil and rushed to the telephone booth, to which Larry's wire had been switched so that the story could be taken with fewer interruptions. Page after page of notes did Mr. Newton scribble down, as Larry dictated the dramatic finding of the missing millionaire during the automobile chase. "That'll do, Larry," cried Mr. Newton when he had the first half of the story. "I'll get one of the other boys to take the rest while I grind this out on the machine." So the young reporter dictated the remainder of the account to another person in the Leader office, while Mr. Newton was pounding away on the typewriter at his section. Thus it went on in relays. The first part of the story was in type before Larry had finished his end of it. Then, as there was no more time to get anything further in for the first edition, Larry went back to where he had left Mr. Potter, Grace, and Fritch in the automobile. Mr. Potter gave the young reporter some additional particulars. He explained that he had learned, while in Europe, of a mix-up in New York politics that involved his company, which was building the new subway line. Sullivan, Kilburn, and Riley were factors in the game, and the control of the Assembly District would go to whoever could bring about the opening of the new subway route through it. Mr. Potter repeated, more at detail, how there was likely to be a big lawsuit over the matter, which would tie up operations for a year, and which would force down the price of the stock so that many small investors would lose all they owned. I had promised Sullivan to do as he wanted, in case he supported Riley, Mr. Potter went on. Later I found I could not do as I had agreed without getting tangled up in the legal conflict. They wanted to serve certain papers on me and get me into the jurisdiction of the law courts, so I decided, in order to protect those who were unable to protect themselves, to disappear. I was aware that a wrong construction might be placed on it, that it would subject me to much criticism, that it would be hard, and that it would cause distress to my family and friends. But there was no other way in which I could aid the helpless, so I decided to do it. The millionaire explained how he had sailed from Italy under an assumed name, after arranging there with his friend, Mr. Simonson, to precede him to New York, do certain work, and keep him informed of how matters went. Simonson took the name reeto, which had a foreign sound and could be depended upon to deceive Mr. Potter's enemies. Mr. Simonson was of dark complexion and looked like an East Indian. The name was formed from some of the letters making up the millionaire's name. Reeto's handwriting was very similar to that of Mr. Potter's, and easily passed for it, even under the scrutiny of Grace and her mother. The man himself bore a remarkable resemblance to the millionaire and nearly deceived Grace once. Most unexpectedly, some of Mr. Potter's enemies got on the trail of Reeto, and he learned they would be waiting for him when he landed in New York. He decided to elude them. He was aboard the Olivia when the ship struck on the bar, and resolved to take a desperate chance and come ashore on a life raft. He did, and Larry and Bailey rescued him. Then followed his shaving off of his mustache in the fisherman's hut to make a good disguise, and Larry's subsequent chase after him. Once Larry had been close on Mr. Potter's trail. The millionaire was in Reeto's room the night Larry called on the mysterious man in the Jackson tenement, and this explained the reference in the letter to the young reporter being so close after Mr. Potter. Sullivan, it was explained, had an idea that Grace or her mother knew where Mr. Potter was hiding, and was much disappointed because the rich man could not carry out the original plan of political action. "I think Sullivan will show himself, now that he knows I have been found," said Grace's father. "He has been looking for me on his own responsibility, I understand. I have straightened matters out so that he can support Riley, as he promised to do, Larry, in that interview he gave you. I think that was all he wanted me to come back for. Sullivan used to go up and watch my house," Mr. Potter went on. "He thought I was there, I suppose. Reeto also watched it, but for a different purpose. I sent him up to catch glimpses of my wife and daughter, to see if they were all right, as I did not dare venture into that neighborhood for fear of being recognized. I had their miniatures, however. The night I reached New York, I went to the house and got them. I remained in the suburbs of Jersey City most of the time, as, until today, the scoundrels did not have matters so arranged that they could legally serve papers on me in New Jersey. They must have taken a last desperate chance this morning. But, thanks to you, Larry, they were foiled. In Fritch's auto, after Larry had finished telephoning in the story, the little party returned to New York. They took Mr. Simonson, or Reeto, from the hospital to Mr. Potter's house. There he explained his part in aiding the millionaire. Larry gave him back the papers he had secured from Captain Trella and the curious gold coin Mr. Simonson had lost from his watch chain in the fisherman's hut. Mr. Simonson told his employer how he had tried to run away from Larry that day on the pier, as matters were then not yet ripe for a disclosure, and how he had fallen under the horse's feet. "When you came to see me in the hospital," he went on to Larry, "I was about to send for Mr. Potter, for I felt I was in bad shape and that the mystery might now come to an end. Then I became unconscious, was delirious for 3 weeks, and the next I knew was when the nurse told me this morning that the day after tomorrow you were coming to see me. I decided I must communicate with Mr. Potter. But when I called him up, I was startled when I was told by the man in whose house he was hiding that his enemies had him. But Larry got me away from them," went on Mr. Potter with a happy laugh. "This ends the mystery of my disappearance. I must telegraph Mother the good news," said Grace. "She is in Lakewood. I had also better notify the private detective that he need no longer work on the case. We'll go to Lakewood and surprise your mother," said her father. "I need a rest after my hard work in keeping away from Larry Dexter. I'll telephone the detective agency. I suppose the manager will be disappointed that a newspaper man beat him," which was exactly how the manager felt. The young reporter, bidding Grace and her father goodbye, returned to the office of the leader, going down in Fritch's auto. "Well, you have given us some news," exclaimed Mr. Imberg. "Look at that." He held up the paper, the front page of which was almost all taken up with the story of the missing millionaire. "I suppose that ends my special assignment, then." "This one is finished," spoke the city editor, "but I may have another for you." "What kind?" "I'll tell you later. Those of my readers who want to know what Larry's next assignment was may learn by reading the 4th volume of this series, to be called Larry Dexter and the Bank Mystery, or A Young Reporter in Wall Street. In that story, we shall follow the young reporter through adventures which were exciting in the extreme. The leader beat every other paper in New York on the Potter story, and Larry was the hero of the occasion. The next day, he located Sullivan and cleared up that end of the case. "I suppose you'd like to take a short rest," said Mr. Imberg to the young reporter a few days later. "You had quite a strenuous time of it in that automobile race. I guess I could stand a little vacation." "Then you shall have it." Larry wondered where he would spend the vacation, but the matter was settled for him. When he got home that night, he found a telegram awaiting him. It was from Grace Potter, and read, "Can't you come down to Lakewood for a few days? Mother and father would be glad to see you." So would I. Larry went, and with that, we reached the conclusion of Larry Dexter and the Missing Millionaire. After a thrilling journey filled with mystery, danger, and determination, Larry has finally unraveled the truth and brought the case to a close. His sharp instincts and unwavering persistence have once again proven that a true journalist never gives up in the search for the truth. I hope you enjoyed this exciting adventure. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more classic audiobooks. Your support helps keep these timeless stories alive. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the story. Did you guess the ending? Or did the mystery surprise you? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next audiobook.